Before we begin today's story, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone watching. The incredible community that has grown around MrBallen is the reason these strange, dark, and mysterious stories continue to be shared. Every view, every comment, and every person who takes the time to listen means more than you probably realize. So if you're here right now, whether you've been watching for years or this is your very first video, thank you for being here and for supporting the channel. Now, let's get into today's strange, dark, and mysterious story. Story 1. Island of the Dolls. The air in the canals of Xochimilco does not feel like the fresh floral scent of a floating garden. It feels heavy, stagnant, and carries a thick, sickly odor of algae, rotting plastic, and the faint, metallic tang of stagnant water that has been trapped for centuries. When you step onto the small island, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your skin. It is a world of thousands of unblinking eyes and dead plastic. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a low, rhythmic clicking of plastic limbs hitting each other in the breeze. The texture of the air is damp and sticky, leaving a bitter taste of mildew in the back of your throat. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the thousands of decaying dolls hanging from the trees are all drawing breath at once. It is a sensory warning that you are being watched by something that was never truly meant to be alive. In the 1950s, a 50-year-old man named Don Julian Santana Barrera was exactly where a man seeking peace and penance belonged. He was a quiet, deeply religious man who decided to leave his wife and children to live a solitary life on a chinampa in the middle of the vast canal system of Mexico City. He was a person of simple needs and a strong work ethic. He was exactly where a hermit wanted to be, surrounded by the water and the absolute silence of nature. The ritual of life on the island followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of farming and scavenging that occupied Julian's entire day for 50 years. Every single morning at 5 o'clock, he would begin the long process of tending to his crops. It started with the soil. He would spend nearly 3 hours using a small wooden shovel to turn the rich, dark mud of the floating garden, ensuring that his vegetables had the nutrients they needed to grow in the hot sun. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, his hands covered in the cool, wet earth of the canals. After the farming was finished, he would move to his small boat. He would row for miles through the narrow waterways, traveling to the edge of the city to scavenge for supplies. He had a specific interest in the discarded items he found in the trash heaps. He was a man who saw value in things the rest of the world decided were useless. He was just a normal guy. But one humid morning in the 1950s, the mundane rhythm of his solitary life began to shift in a way that would lead to a terror that lasted for 5 decades. The subtle shift happened when Julian found the body of a young girl floating in the water near his shore. He tried to save her, but she was already gone. He found a single, small doll floating in the reeds nearby. He believed the doll belonged to the girl and that her spirit was now attached to it. Julian began to feel a presence on his island that wasn't there before. He heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden deck and a low, mournful sobbing coming from the trees in the middle of the night. He believed that the spirit of the drowned girl was angry and that he needed to appease her. He took the doll he had found and hung it from a branch as a sign of respect. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder and more frantic as the sun went down. Julian became convinced that one doll was not enough to protect him from the girl's ghost. He began to collect every doll he could find in the canals and the trash. He didn't care if they were missing eyes, limbs, or heads. He would bring them back to his island, wash them in the gray water, and hang them from the trees with pieces of old wire. He spent his afternoons arranging the decaying toys in a circle around his small hut like a macabre and silent army. He took immense pride in his role as the caretaker of the dead dolls, knowing that every single one was a shield against the darkness. He would spend the final hour of his day talking to the dolls, telling them about his life, and asking for their protection. He would use a small brush to clean the cobwebs from their plastic faces, a slow and very silent labor of obsession. He felt safe on the island, believing that the dolls were the only things that truly cared. You are standing on that small, muddy island in the middle of the night in 1990. You are Julian, and you are surrounded by over 1,000 decaying dolls. Some are just heads tied to branches, their empty sockets staring at the moon. Others are scorched by the sun, their plastic skin peeling like a burnt body. You hear a sound in the dark, a low, wet giggle that isn't coming from a doll. You feel a cold hand brush against the back of your neck? Do you stay on the island and continue to hang dolls, knowing that the spirit you are trying to appease is getting stronger every year? Do you tell yourself that you are just a lonely man with a vivid imagination and that the dolls are just plastic and straw? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the canal and realize that the dolls have begun to move their heads toward you? Because here's the thing, Julian didn't leave. He stayed for 50 years in the dark. The bizarre reveal came in 2001. Julian's nephew came to the island to help him with the harvest and found the old man dead. Julian was lying face down in the water in the exact same spot where he had found the drowned girl 50 years earlier. He had died of a heart attack, but the locals believed the dolls had finally claimed him. The energy of his obsession had turned the island into a physical graveyard of plastic and unsaid prayers. Today, the Island of the Dolls is a world-famous site of the macabre, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead is as thin as a piece of wire. Visitors report seeing the dolls open their eyes and hearing them whisper to each other in the dark. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused dread. It serves as a haunting reminder that a single act of grief can grow into a forest of nightmares that refuses to let the past fade into the mist. Julian was a man who believed he could bargain with a ghost using broken toys, but he learned that some spirits are never satisfied. He is a reminder that the energy we leave behind can become a presence that survives long after we are gone. But as the plastic eyes continue to watch the canals of Mexico, thousands of miles away in the shadows of Mount Fuji, there is a place where the trees themselves seem to feed on the sorrow of the people who enter. It is a vast, dense woodland where the compasses don't work and the silence is so heavy it can break a person's mind. It is a place where thousands have gone to lose themselves and where the forest never gives back what it takes. Welcome to Aokigahara. I have finished the 31st story about the Island of the Dolls with all 8 modules and a bridge to the next story. Story 2, Aokigahara Forest, the Sea of Trees. The air in the Aokigahara Forest does not feel like the crisp mountain air of the Japanese highlands. It feels heavy, stagnant, and carries a thick, earthy odor of wet moss, decaying leaves, and the faint metallic tang of iron-rich volcanic rock that interferes with every compass. When you step off the designated path, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your ears. It is a world of shadows and twisted trees. When you move deeper into the Sea of Trees, the texture of the world changes. You feel the spongy, uneven ground under your boots, a floor made of hardened lava that hides deep, invisible fissures. The air carries a thick, suffocating quality that makes your heart race, and you smell the cloying, sweet scent of rotting wood. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a low, rhythmic tapping of branches hitting each other. It is a sensory warning of a place that eats sound. In the spring of 2004, a 26-year-old man named Kenji was exactly where a nature lover from the crowded streets of Tokyo was supposed to be. He was a talented amateur photographer with a brand new camera and a desire to capture the raw beauty of the wilderness. He was a person who valued solitude and the quiet dignity of the mountains. He was exactly where a hiker wanted to be, walking into the woods on a clear, sunny Tuesday morning in early May. Kenji was a man of quiet observation and deep intellect. At 26, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to see the beauty in the small details of the natural world. He wasn't just a tourist, he was a person who respected the traditions of his culture and the power of the land. He loved the technical side of his hobby, the lenses, the light meters, and the way the sun hit the forest floor. He was a happy, healthy man who lived in a world of tangibles. The ritual of his photography followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of preparation and adjustment that occupied his entire afternoon. Every single hour, Kenji would move to a new section of the woods, beginning his process from the ground up. It started with the tripod. He would spend nearly 15 minutes finding a level spot on the jagged lava rock, ensuring the legs were secure. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the cold metal of the gear. He would then move to the light meter. He would spend the middle of the day holding the small device toward the canopy, watching the needle flicker back and forth. He had to be careful to set the aperture exactly right for the deep shadows of the forest, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. After the settings were recorded, he would take a single, long exposure photograph. He liked the mechanical certainty of the click and the manual wind. In the late afternoon, Kenji decided to follow a small, abandoned trail that led away from the main path. This was the part of the day that he found most exciting. He would walk through the dense foliage, the sound of his boots thudding on the mossy earth in a rhythmic beat. He would spend hours looking for the perfect shot of the sunlight filtering through the twisted branches. He took immense pride in his ability to find the hidden patterns in the chaos of the trees. He would spend the final hour of sunlight recording the coordinates in a heavy, leather-bound notebook, ensuring that every location was documented for his portfolio. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe in the woods, believing that as long as he stayed focused on his art, the darkness could never touch him. He was a man who felt in control of his destiny. It was a perfect, mundane life in the woods. But as the sun began to dip behind the peaks of Mount Fuji, the mundane rhythm of his hike began to shift in a way that would lead to a terror no one could have predicted. The subtle shift happened when Kenji looked down at his compass and realized the needle was spinning in frantic, useless circles. He checked the map, but the landmarks didn't match the reality of the forest anymore. He noticed that the trees were getting much closer together than they should be. He began to feel an overwhelming sensation of being watched from the dense thicket, even though he was the only living thing for miles. The air in the forest didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy. He heard a sound from the deep woods, a low, rhythmic tapping like a person hitting a tree with a heavy stone. The atmosphere in the sea of trees changed. The sound of his own breathing became loud and ragged in his ears. He realized he was lost in the dark. The shift became even more pronounced when he found a roll of colored plastic tape tied to a branch. In Aokigahara, hikers use tape to find their way back, but this tape had been cut. Kenji followed the ribbon for 50 yards, only to find it ended at the base of a tree where a single worn-out shoe was sitting in the moss. He felt a sudden, sharp draft of air on his neck, and the smell of jasmine and rotting meat filled his lungs. He felt a weight on his chest. You are standing in that dark, silent forest in 2004. You are Kenji, and you have just realized that your path home has been erased. You are surrounded by trees that look like frozen screams, and the sun has vanished behind the mountain. You hear a sound in the dark, a low, wet whisper that calls your name from the shadows. You feel a coldness that reaches into your marrow. You realize that the forest is not a park, but a place that feeds on grief. Do you stay where you are and wait for the morning, knowing that the temperature will drop below freezing? Do you try to run through the dense brush, knowing that one wrong step into a lava fissure will break your legs? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the woods and realize that the voice you are hearing is coming from a place that doesn't exist? Because here is the thing, Kenji didn't have time to choose. The shadows were already closing in on him. The bizarre reveal came when Kenji looked up into the branches of the tree above him. He didn't see a ghost, he saw a small, weather-beaten envelope tucked into a hollow in the bark. He opened it with trembling hands and found a note written in a frantic, shaky script. It wasn't a suicide note, it was a warning to the next person who found it. The note said, "The trees are not what they seem. They move when you blink. Do not follow the sound of the tapping in the night." Kenji managed to survive the night by huddled against a rock, but he was never the same man again. He told the search party that the trees had actually shifted their positions while he slept, blocking the path he had taken. The Aokigahara forest remains a place of profound mystery and sorrow, where the Japanese authorities conduct annual body searches to recover the hundreds of people who go there to vanish. The energy of all that despair is etched into the wood. Today, the Sea of Trees is a place where signs at the entrance beg people to think of their families and to seek help. Visitors report seeing figures in the mist and hearing the sound of voices coming from the empty ground. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused dread. It serves as a haunting reminder that a beautiful forest can become a fortress of memory that refuses to let the past fade. Kenji survived, but he left a piece of his soul among the roots. The forest of Japan proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the years, anchoring thousands of souls to its silent paths. But as the shadows continue to move through the Sea of Trees, thousands of miles away in the underground of France, there is a place where the hauntings are not tied to trees, but to the bones of 6 million people. It is a massive labyrinth where the walls are made of the dead. Story 3, Catacombs of Paris, The Lost Explorer. The air, 20 meters beneath the busy streets of Paris, does not feel like the fresh, springtime breeze of the Luxembourg Gardens. It feels heavy, ancient, and carries a thick, chalky odor of pulverized limestone, stagnant humidity, and the faint, sweet scent of 6 million human souls that have been reduced to bone and dust. When you step into the illegal tunnels of the catacombs, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your ears. When you move deeper into the unmapped labyrinth, the texture of the world changes. You feel the cool, slick moisture of the condensation dripping from the ceiling, landing on your neck with a shock that feels like a ghost touch. The air carries a thick, metallic quality that tastes like blood in the back of your throat. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a low, rhythmic dripping of water hitting a pile of skulls. It is a sensory warning of a massive underground grave. The walls of the tunnels are not made of stone alone, but of the neatly stacked remains of centuries of Parisians. You can feel the hollow eye sockets of the skulls watching you as you pass their rough, porous texture catching on your clothes. The ground under your boots is a mixture of fine limestone dust and the crushed fragments of smaller bones, making every step sound like a dry, rhythmic crunch. It is a world of white and gray, where the only light is the one you bring. In the winter of 1991, a 30-year-old man whose name remains a mystery to the public was exactly where a daring urban explorer wanted to be. He was a fit, adventurous guy with a high-quality video camera and a deep obsession with the hidden history of the world. He was a person who valued the thrill of discovery and the technical challenge of navigating the unmapped. He was exactly where any cataphile wanted to be, entering the forbidden tunnels. This man was a person of quiet observation and deep intellect. At 30 years old, he was known among the underground community for his steady hand and his ability to see the beauty in the macabre. He wasn't just a tourist. He was a scholar of the shadows, someone who felt the weight of the history that the city above had tried to bury. He loved the technical side of his hobby, the lenses, the light meters, and the way his torch illuminated the ancient carved symbols. He was the kind of person who understood that the catacombs were more than just a graveyard. They were a city of the dead with its own streets and its own secrets. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his exploration, the way the silence felt like a shield, and the sound of his own breathing reminded him he was alive. He was a happy, healthy man who lived in a world of tangibles, seemingly shielded by his logic from any superstition. He was just a normal guy. The ritual of his exploration followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of equipment checks and mapping that occupied his entire evening. Every single hour, the man would stop to check his gear, beginning with the batteries. He would spend nearly 10 minutes sitting on a pile of femurs, switching out the lithium cells in his high-powered flashlight. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the cold, knurled metal of the casing and the click of the switch. He would then move to the mapping. He would spend the middle of the night holding a hand-drawn chart against the limestone walls, using a pencil to mark the intersections he had passed. He had to be careful to note every turn and every decline, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. After the map was updated, he would record a few seconds of footage for his documentary. He liked the mechanical certainty of the camera and the clarity of the lens. In the late evening, he reached the section known as the ossuary. This was the part of the journey that he found most significant. He would walk through the rows of neatly stacked skulls and tibiae, the sound of his boots thudding on the sandy floor in a rhythmic beat. He would spend hours looking for the perfect angle to capture the symmetry of the dead. He took immense pride in his role as a witness to the forgotten, knowing that his footage was a tribute to the past. He would spend the final hour of his exploration recording the names of the streets carved into the stone above him, ensuring that every detail was documented for his future film. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe in the tunnels, believing that as long as he stayed focused on his task, the darkness could never touch him. He was a man who felt in control of his path. It was a perfect, mundane life. But as the clock reached 3:45 on a Wednesday morning, the mundane rhythm of his journey began to shift in a way that made his blood run cold. The subtle shift happened when he realized that the air in the tunnel was getting much warmer than it should be in the middle of the earth. The air didn't just get humid, it became suffocating, as if he were walking into a wet furnace. He noticed that the walls of the tunnel were starting to look very different. Instead of the neatly stacked bones, the walls were now jagged, raw limestone covered in a thick black mold that seemed to pulse in the beam of his light. He checked his map, but the markings didn't match the intersections anymore. He began to feel an overwhelming sensation of being watched from the darkness behind him, even though he had been alone for hours. The atmosphere in the tunnels changed. The sound of his own breathing became loud and ragged in his ears. The shift became physical when his camera began to malfunction. He looked through the viewfinder and saw a blur of movement near the ground. It wasn't a person. It was a mass of pure, concentrated shadow that seemed to be crawling along the floor. He blinked, and it was gone. He heard a sound from the deep tunnels, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a person running toward him with bare feet. The sound of his own heart was slamming against his ribs in the absolute dark. He began to run, the heavy camera bouncing against his chest as he scrambled through the narrow passages. He didn't check the map anymore, he just ran toward what he thought was the exit. But the tunnels were a labyrinth that had no end. He felt a sudden, sharp draft of air on his face, and the smell of rotting meat and wet lime filled his lungs. He felt a coldness that reached into his very soul. He realized that the unmapped tunnels were not just empty and silent stone. You are standing in that dark, narrow tunnel in 1991. You are this unnamed man, and you have just realized that you are hopelessly lost in a maze of 6 million dead. Your flashlight is flickering, and your only source of light is about to die. You hear a sound from the darkness ahead, a low, wet whisper that says your name. You feel a hand brush against your ankle. Do you keep running into the unknown, or do you stay and wait for the end in the silence? Do you tell yourself that you are just a tired man with a wild imagination, and that the voices are just the wind through the ventilation shafts? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the catacombs and realize that the things in the unmapped sections have already found you? Because here is the thing. The man didn't wait to find out. He dropped his camera and ran into the absolute blackness. He was never seen or heard from by any living person in the city again. The bizarre reveal came years later when a group of explorers found the video camera sitting in the middle of a remote tunnel. It wasn't damaged or dusty. When they watched the footage, they saw a man who was clearly terrified, running as if his life depended on it. But the most chilling part was what happened at the very end. The man stopped, looked directly into the lens, and then looked over his shoulder. He let out a scream that didn't sound like a human being. The camera showed a flash of something in the dark behind him, a pale, translucent shape that moved with a speed that defied physics. The camera then hit the ground and continued to record for several minutes. You could hear the man's footsteps getting further away, and then a second set of footsteps followed him. They weren't the sound of boots, they were the wet slapping sounds of bare feet on the stone. The search parties found nothing in the deep tunnels. Today, the catacombs of Paris remain a place of profound mystery and ancient dread, a massive subterranean graveyard where the barrier between the past and the present is very thin. The footage of the lost man remains one of the most famous pieces of paranormal evidence ever captured. It serves as a haunting reminder that some labyrinths are not meant to be mapped. The energy of the 6 million dead is etched into the very limestone of the beautiful city of light. The catacombs proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring souls to the very tunnels where they were lost. But, as the wet footsteps continue to echo through the underground of France, hundreds of miles to the north in the English county of Gloucestershire, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a single ancient inn. It is a place built on an ancient pagan burial ground where the devil is said to visit. Story 4. Ancient Ram Inn, the Devil's Resting Place. The air inside the ancient Ram Inn in the small village of Watton-under-Edge does not feel like the fresh, floral breeze of the English countryside. It feels heavy, ancient, and carries a thick, suffocating odor of damp wool, sulfur, and the faint, sweet scent of rotting meat that has been trapped behind stone for 800 years. When you stand in the bishop's room, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure in your teeth. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a low, rhythmic scratching coming from beneath the heavy oak floorboards. The texture of the air is thick and stagnant, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in the back of your throat that makes you want to choke. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the air itself is being squeezed out of the room by an invisible weight. It is a sensory warning that you are standing on a spot where the earth is broken. When you move toward the stairs, you smell the cloying, sharp scent of old beer and wet iron. You hear a sound that isn't a house settling, but a high-pitched, childlike giggle that echoes through the empty corridors. The walls are covered in a fine layer of dust and history that feels like a physical hand pressing against your face. You feel an icy draft that doesn't come from a window, but seems to rise directly from the floor. This is a house of many shadows. In 1968, a 34-year-old man named John Humphreys was exactly where a person who loved history and old buildings wanted to be. He was a normal guy, a former train driver with a deep passion for preservation who had just purchased a crumbling 800-year-old building in Gloucestershire. He was a person who valued the past and the solid reality of stone and wood. He was exactly where a dreamer belonged, looking to save a piece of history. John was a man of quiet observation and immense physical stamina. At 34, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to see the beauty in a derelict structure that most people wanted to tear down. He wasn't just a property owner, he was a caretaker of the soul of the village. He loved the technical side of restoration, the way the ancient beams were notched and the history of the materials. He was a happy, healthy man who lived in a world of tools. He was the kind of person who understood that the ancient Ram Inn was more than just a house. It was a relic of a time when the world was much darker and more mysterious. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his labor, the way the morning light hit the old windows, and the sound of his hammer on the stone. He was a man who lived in a world of tangibles, seemingly shielded by his logic from any superstition. He was just a guy with a vision and a dream. The ritual of restoration followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of cleaning and cataloging that occupied John's entire day for years. Every single morning at 7 o'clock, he would begin the long process of clearing the debris from the lower rooms. It started with the floors. He would spend nearly 3 hours using a small wire brush to scrub the centuries of dirt from the flagstones. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the cold weight of the rock. He would then move to the woodwork. He would spend the middle of the day standing on a ladder, using a soft cloth and a mixture of oil and beeswax to polish the massive oak beams that supported the ceiling. He had to be careful to treat the wood with respect, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. After the beams were polished, he would record the markings in a heavy, leather-bound notebook. He liked the mechanical certainty of his daily work. In the late afternoon, John would work on the drainage system. This was the part of the day that he found most significant. He would crawl into the narrow spaces beneath the floor, the sound of his breathing echoing in the small tunnels. He would spend hours checking the pipes and the foundations, ensuring that the water from the nearby stream wasn't eroding the stone. He took pride in his role as a builder, knowing that his work was preserving a piece of the past. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the architectural details in a heavy journal, ensuring that every joint and every stone was documented with a steady hand. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe in the inn, believing that as long as he focused on the physical structure, the building would respect his efforts. He was a man in control of his path. It was a perfect, mundane life. But on his very first night in the house, the mundane rhythm of his life began to shift in a way that would lead to a terror that lasted for 50 years. The subtle shift happened when John was lying in his bed in the bishop's room. The air in the room didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy. He heard a sound that was not the house settling. It was a low, rhythmic growl that seemed to come from the very corner where he had placed his suitcase that night. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure on his chest, and an invisible force grabbed him by the arms and dragged him across the floor. John was a strong man, but he couldn't fight back against the grip. He was pulled out of his bed and toward the door, his skin burning as it scraped against the old floorboards. He managed to grab a heavy wooden chair, and the force suddenly let go. The atmosphere in the inn changed. The sound of his own heart was loud in his ears. The shift became even more pronounced as John began to dig deeper into the foundations of the house. He discovered that the inn was not built on a normal piece of land. It was sitting directly on the intersection of two major ley lines, which are believed by many to be conduits for ancient spiritual energy. Even more disturbing, he found that the inn was built on an ancient pagan burial ground that had been used for child sacrifices over 5,000 years ago. John started finding physical evidence of the darkness. While digging under the stairs, he found the skeletal remains of 2 young children and a small rusted iron dagger buried alongside them. He felt a coldness that reached into his very soul. He began to hear voices in the night, a low, wet whisper that said his name and told him to leave. He noticed that the shadows in the inn weren't moving with the sun. They stayed fixed and dark even in the middle of a noon. The atmosphere in the bishop's room became so thick with dread that even the most hardened visitors couldn't stay for more than a few minutes. John reported seeing a tall, dark figure he called the bishop, who would stand at the foot of his bed and stare at him with unblinking hollow eyes. He also encountered a succubus, a malevolent female spirit that would pin people to their beds and drain their energy. The inn was becoming a fortress of the supernatural world. You are standing in that dark, cold bishop's room in 1995. You are a paranormal investigator, and you have just set up your recording equipment for the night. Suddenly, the air goes freezing, and the smell of sulfur fills the room. You hear a sound from the corner, a low, rhythmic thumping like a heart beating inside the wall. You see a shadow move toward you, and you feel a sudden, sharp pain in your shoulder. You realize that you are being hunted. Do you stay and try to capture the evidence, knowing that your cameras are already starting to malfunction? Do you try to call out to John in the next room, knowing that the walls are too thick for your voice to reach him? Or do you listen to that voice in your head that tells you that you are standing in a place where the barrier between the worlds is broken? Because here is the thing, the bishop's room doesn't let you leave without leaving a piece of yourself behind. The bizarre reveal came when John consulted a local medium. They told him that the inn was a portal for something they called an elemental, a being of pure, ancient energy that was tied to the land itself. The house wasn't just haunted by ghosts of people, it was occupied by something that had never been human. The energy of the 5,000-year-old sacrifices was still being fed by the malice of the building. John realized he wasn't just an owner, he was. John Humphreys lived in the ancient Ram Inn for the rest of his life, despite being attacked and terrified on a nightly basis. He became a legend in the world of the paranormal, a man who shared his home with the darkness because he felt it was his duty to protect the building. He died in 2017, and his daughter continues to care for the inn today. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused dread. It is a place that refuses to be silent. The ancient Ram Inn proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring a being of pure darkness to its stone walls. But as the scratching continues beneath the floorboards of England, thousands of miles away in the high desert of California, there is a place where the hauntings are not tied to a single house, but to an entire city frozen in time. A place where a curse follows anyone who takes so much as a single pebble. Story 5. Bodie Ghost Town, the Curse of the Souvenir. The air in the high desert of the Sierra Nevada mountains near Bodie, California, does not feel like the fresh, pine-scented breeze of a typical forest. It feels incredibly dry, stagnant, and carries a thick, earthy odor of old sagebrush, sun-baked wood, and the faint, metallic scent of rusted iron that has been exposed to the elements for over 160 years. When you stand on the main street of this abandoned town, the silence is not a peaceful quiet. It is a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your ears and deep in your chest, a silence that seems to be holding its breath. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but the low, rhythmic creaking of a wooden sign swinging on a rusted hinge, a sound that echoes through the empty saloons. The texture of the air is gritty and abrasive, leaving a fine layer of gray dust on your skin and a bitter, alkaline taste in the back of your throat that makes you want to cough. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the altitude and the history of the place are trying to squeeze the life out of you. The air carries a thick, suffocating quality that makes every breath feel like you are inhaling the ghost of a dead empire. You hear a distant, hollow thud from the bottom of an old mine shaft, a sound that vibrates through the dry earth and into the soles of your boots. It is a sensory warning that the town is not truly empty. In the early 1860s, a 40-year-old man named William Bodie was exactly where a hopeful prospector during the gold rush was supposed to be. He was a hard-working, ambitious man who had just discovered a massive vein of gold in the hills of Mono County. He was a person who valued the dream of wealth and the solid reality of the ground beneath him. He was exactly where any adventurer wanted to be, standing on the edge of a fortune in the rugged California wild. But instead of living a life of luxury, William would die in a blizzard just months after his discovery, and the town that was named after him would grow into one of the most violent and lawless places in the American West. The mystery is not just how the gold ran out, but why the town of Bodie remains in a state of arrested decay, and why anyone who dares to take even a single pebble from the ground finds themselves targeted by a curse that ruins their entire life. In the 1970s, a 35-year-old park ranger named Bill was a man who believed in rules, preservation, and the absolute logic of the natural world. He was a steady, disciplined professional who had spent 10 years working for the California State Park System. He was exactly where a protector of history wanted to be, living in one of the few habitable houses in Bodie to ensure that the artifacts of the 1900s were never disturbed by anyone. Bill was a man of quiet observation and deep intellect. At 35, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to fix anything from a broken window to a rusted engine. He wasn't just a ranger, he was a caretaker of the silence, someone who understood the weight of the history that the desert was trying to reclaim. He loved the technical side of his job, the maps, the restoration techniques, and the way the sun hit the yellow grass in the late afternoon heat. He was the kind of person who understood that Bodie was a museum of the soul, a place where time had stopped in 1942. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his patrols, the way the morning light hit the old church, and the sound of his boots on the wooden boardwalks. He was a happy, healthy man who lived in a world of physical reality and tangible objects, seemingly shielded by his logic from any superstition. He was just a normal guy with a job. The ritual of his patrol followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of observation and maintenance that occupied his entire day. Every single morning at 7 o'clock, he would begin the long process of checking the buildings. It started with the glass. He would spend nearly 3 hours walking through the town using a small notebook to record every single pane of window glass that had been cracked by the wind or the shifting of the ancient and very dry wooden frames. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the rough texture of the weathered siding and the smell of the old linseed oil on the sills. After the glass was checked, he would move to the saloons. He would spend the middle of the day standing in the shadows of the old bars, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes to ensure that the bottles and the furniture were exactly where they were left 60 years ago. He liked the mechanical certainty of his work. In the late afternoon, Bill would move to the post office. This was the part of the day that he found most significant and yet most repetitive. He would spend hours sorting through the official correspondence from the state, but he also had to deal with a different kind of mail. He would receive dozens of small, heavy packages from all over the world, each one containing a single rock, a rusted nail, or a piece of broken glass. He took pride in his role as the returner. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the contents of these packages in a heavy, leather-bound ledger, ensuring that every stolen item was documented before he returned it to the exact spot where it had been taken. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe in the ghost town, believing that as long as he respected the items, the history would respect him. He was a man in total control. But by the summer of 1977, the mundane rhythm of his job began to shift in a way that would lead to a realization no one could have predicted. The subtle shift happened when Bill started reading the letters that came with the returned items. They weren't just simple apologies, they were frantic, desperate pleas for help. People wrote about losing their jobs, their houses burning down, and their families falling apart within days of leaving Bodie. He began to notice that the air in the post office was getting much colder than it should be in the middle of a desert summer. The air didn't just get cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet dread. He heard a sound from the empty rooms of the house next door, a rhythmic thumping like a person in heavy boots pacing back and forth on the floorboards. The atmosphere in the town changed. The sound of his own breathing became loud and ragged in his very own ears. The shift became even more pronounced when Bill received a package from a man in Germany. Inside was a small, purple glass bottle that had been taken from the general store 10 years earlier. The letter that came with it was 10 pages long, written in a shaky, terrified hand. The man claimed that since taking the bottle, his business had gone bankrupt, his wife had left him, and he had been in 3 near-fatal car accidents. He begged Bill to put it back immediately. Bill, being a man of science, tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but he couldn't ignore the sheer volume of the letters. Every single person who took a piece of Bodhi was experiencing a level of bad luck that defied all logic. He noticed that the shadows in the town weren't moving with the sun anymore. They stayed fixed and dark even in the middle of the day. He felt a sudden, sharp draft of air on his neck, and the smell of jasmine and rotting meat filled his room. You are standing on that empty main street in 1977. You are Bill, and you have just realized that the town you are guarding is protecting itself. You are surrounded by buildings that look like they are waiting for something to happen. You hear a sound in the dark, a low, wet whisper that says your name from the shadows of the old hotel. You feel a coldness that reaches into your marrow. You realize that the town is not a museum, but a living entity. Do you stay and continue to return the items, knowing that the energy of the curse is passing through your hands every day? Do you try to explain it to the state officials, knowing they will think you have been in the desert for too long? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the mountain and realize that the items are not just objects, but anchors for the souls of the 10,000 people who died in this place? Because here is the thing, the items are never happy. The bizarre reveal came when Bill decided to investigate the curse folder in the park archives. He found that the letters had been coming in since the town was declared a state park in 1962. Thousands of people had returned even the smallest pieces of wood, all reporting the same horrific luck. He realized that the Bodhi curse wasn't a legend invented by the Rangers to stop theft, it was a physical manifestation of the town's refusal to be forgotten. Even more disturbing, he found a letter from a man who had taken a rusted nail and then returned it, but his bad luck didn't stop until he came back to the town in person and apologized to the ground. Bill realized that the energy of the lawless, violent history of Bodhi was so strong that it had saturated every single rock and every single piece of wood. The town was a fortress of memory that used misfortune as its only weapon against the greed of the living world. Today, Bodhi remains one of the best preserved ghost towns in the world, a place of arrested decay where the ghosts of the past are still in charge. Visitors are warned by the Rangers not to take anything, not even a single pebble, but every year the packages continue to arrive at the post office. People report seeing figures in the windows of the empty houses and hearing the sound of a phantom piano playing in the middle of the night. The energy is very real. Bill was a man who believed in the safety of his logic, but he learned that some places have a memory that survives through the centuries. He spent the rest of his life as a guardian of the silence, but he never looked at a rock or a nail the same way again. He had learned that the world is much darker than we like to admit, and some history is meant to be left exactly where it fell. He is a reminder that the dead are never truly gone if their home is still standing. The cursed town of Bodhi proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the years, anchoring thousands of souls to its dry and dusty streets. But as the wind continues to creak, the wooden signs of California, thousands of miles to the southeast, in the humid, moss-draped city of New Orleans, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a much more intimate and high society kind of horror. It is a mansion where a secret was hidden in the attic. Story 6. The LaLaurie Mansion. The air in the French Quarter of New Orleans in 1834 does not feel like a typical spring morning in the American South. It feels heavy, wet, and carries a thick, cloying odor of jasmine, horse manure, and the faint, sweet scent of expensive French perfume that is trying to hide something much darker. When you stand on the corner of Royal and Hospital Streets, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure. You hear a sound that isn't the jazz music from the bars, but a low, rhythmic moaning coming from the upper floors of the massive three-story mansion. The texture of the air is sticky and abrasive, leaving a fine layer of gray soot on your skin from a fire that hasn't started yet. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the very bricks of the building are holding their breath. It is a sensory warning of a secret about to be revealed. When you look up at the elegant wrought iron balconies, the world feels smooth and cold, shedding a fine layer of history that sticks to your skin. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the air itself is holding its breath. The air carries a thick, suffocating quality that makes every step feel like you are walking through water. You hear a distant, hollow, metallic click that seems to come from the very metal of the gate under your feet. In 1831, a 44-year-old woman named Delphine LaLaurie was exactly where the most powerful socialite in Louisiana was supposed to be. She was a woman of immense beauty, high social standing, and a fortune that allowed her to host the most lavish parties in the city. She was exactly where a lady belonged, living in a world of fine lace and absolute respectability. She was a person who understood the value of a name and a reputation. Delphine was a woman of deep intelligence and a vibrant social nature. At 44, she was known as the pride of New Orleans society, a woman who spoke with grace and navigated the complex politics of the French Quarter with ease. She was a sturdy, healthy person who took great pride in her role as the mistress of the mansion. She was a person who understood the value of tradition and family loyalty. She was just a normal woman living an extraordinary life. Her husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, was a prominent physician who shared her love for high society. Together, they were the golden couple of the South, a pair that people looked up to for guidance and elegance. They lived in a world of strict social hierarchies and predictable outcomes. To the people of Louisiana, the LaLauries were the gold standard of success. They were a family grounded in the tangible reality of wealth and influence. The ritual of life at the LaLaurie mansion followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of social obligations and domestic management that occupied Delphine's entire day. Every single morning at 7 o'clock, she would begin the long process of her morning toilet. It started with these silver brushes. She would spend nearly an hour in front of her mirror, watching her servant brush her hair exactly 100 times until it shone like polished mahogany. She would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the weight of the silk robe against her skin and the smell of the rosewater on her face. After her hair was finished, she would move to the jewelry. She would use a soft piece of velvet to polish her pearls, ensuring that every single bead was free of dust before she fastened the clasp. She had to be careful to ensure that every detail of her appearance was perfect for the morning walk in the French Quarter. In the late morning, Delphine would begin her tours of the kitchen and the slave quarters. This was the part of the day that she found most significant. She would walk through the rows of workers, the sound of her heavy silk skirts rustling against the stone floor. She would spend hours talking to the head cook about the menu for the evening party and the quality of the fresh seafood. She took pride in her role as the caretaker of the estate and its staff. She would spend the afternoon in the drawing room, receiving guests from the neighboring mansions. She would sit at the small tea table, the sound of the fine china clinking softly in the quiet room. She would pour the tea with a steady hand, talking about the latest news from Paris or the health of the governor. She took pride in her ability to make every guest feel at home, providing the city with a sense of perfect stability in a world of shifting status. She would finish her tea, wash her hands in a porcelain basin, and prepare for her evening rounds. She liked the order of it, the way the small acts of domestic life felt like a shield against the growing tension in the house. She was a woman who felt safe in her routine, believing that as long as she played the part of the dutiful wife, she could endure the coldness of her hidden thoughts. It was a perfect, mundane life in a house built for the silent. But by the winter of 1833, the mundane rhythm of her life began to shift in a way that made the neighbors whisper. The subtle shift happened when people noticed that the slaves in the LaLaurie household were becoming unusually thin and fearful. They didn't just look tired, they looked terrified, as if they were waiting for a blow that never came in public. The air in the mansion didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and very heavy. A neighbor saw a young slave girl named Leah fall to her death from the third-story balcony while being chased by Delphine with a whip. The girl had accidentally pulled a snag in Delphine's hair while brushing it. The investigation that followed found nothing, as Delphine used her influence and her wealth to bury the story. But the atmosphere in the French Quarter changed. People heard a sound from the attic, a low, rhythmic thumping like a heart beating. The shift became even more pronounced on April 10th, 1834, when a fire broke out in the kitchen of the Grand Mansion. The elderly cook, who had been chained to the stove for months, had started the fire as a suicide attempt to end her suffering. She told the rescuers that she was afraid of being taken to the upper room. When the neighbors rushed into the house to help, they found Delphine more concerned about her paintings than the people. "You are standing in that burning kitchen in 1834. You are one of the neighbors who has just broken down the door to the attic, a place where no one has been allowed for years. The smoke is thick and black, and the heat is enough to blister your skin. You hear a sound from the corner, a low, wet whisper that says, 'Help me.' You turn your lantern toward the sound, and you see a sight that makes your heart stop and your stomach turn into a knot. Do you stay and try to rescue the people you see, knowing that the floor is about to collapse beneath your feet? Do you try to call for the doctor, knowing that what has been done to these people is beyond medical help? Or do you look at the woman standing in the hallway, the beautiful socialite in her silk dress, and realize that you are looking at a monster that has been hiding in plain sight for years? Because here's the thing, the world is not always what it seems. How do you reconcile a world where a woman can pour tea with a steady hand in the afternoon and then walk upstairs to perform the most horrific experiments in the evening? Is it possible that the human mind can be divided into such distinct and terrifying rooms? Because the neighbors didn't wait to find out the answers. They saw the truth in the attic, and they realized that the mansion on Royal Street was not a home, but a laboratory of pure silent pain. The bizarre reveal came when they entered the secret room in the attic. They didn't find a few mistreated slaves. They found 7 people who had been tortured and mutilated in ways that defy all logic. Some were chained to the walls, their limbs twisted into unnatural positions. One woman had her bones broken and reset to look like a crab, while another had her skin peeled back to reveal the muscles underneath. It was a factory of human suffering. Delphine had been performing experiments to see how much pain a human body could endure before it stopped working. She had used her medical knowledge and her husband's equipment to create a chamber of horrors that shocked even the most hardened soldiers in the city. The crowd outside the mansion turned into a violent mob when the news broke. They tore the house apart looking for the woman they had once admired, but Delphine was gone into the night. She had escaped in her carriage, fleeing the city and eventually making her way to Paris, where she lived out the rest of her life in total anonymity and absolute wealth. The authorities never caught her, and the victims were left to tell the story of the woman in the silk dress. The energy of the torture was absorbed by the very wood and stone of the mansion, creating a haunting that has lasted for 200 years in the heart of the beautiful French Quarter. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion remains one of the most haunted places in New Orleans, a massive stone monument to a betrayal of humanity that the city can never forget. People who live in the area report seeing the shadows of the victims on the balcony and hearing the sound of the chains rattling in the attic. The energy of the torture is etched into the very bricks of the building. It serves as a haunting reminder that evil can wear a mask of high society. Visitors to the mansion often report feeling a sudden sharp pain in their backs or hearing the sound of a woman crying in a room that is locked from the outside. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused dread, a place where the sunlight never seems to reach the corners of the rooms. It is a reminder that the past is never truly dead, especially when it was written in the blood of the innocent. The mansion stands as a silent witness to a dark history. Delphine LaLaurie was a woman who believed she could use her power to hide her darkness, but she learned that the energy of pain survives long after the fire is out. She is a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look exactly like the people we trust. The mansion on Royal Street stands as a silent witness to a tragedy that changed the city forever, a place where the air is still wet and the silence is never truly empty in the dark. The mansion on Royal Street proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring souls to the very rooms where their lives were turned into a nightmare. But as the shadows continue to move through the French Quarter, thousands of miles away in the city of Los Angeles, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a massive hotel. It is a place where the elevators go to floors that don't exist. Welcome to the Cecil Hotel. This hotel has been the site of dozens of suicides, murders, and the temporary home of some of the most infamous serial killers in American history. It is a place where the energy of the city's darkness seems to congregate, creating a vortex of misery that draws people in and never lets them go. The mystery is not just why so much tragedy happens in one building, but why the shadows seem to be following the guests from the lobby to their very rooms. People have reported seeing the ghost of the young girl, Leah, still running across the roof, her face a mask of terror that never fades. They say that if you stand in the street below at midnight, you can hear the sound of a whip cracking and the soft thud of a body hitting the pavement. It is a haunting that is not just seen, but felt in the pit of your stomach. The city of New Orleans has tried to move on, but the mansion on Royal Street refuses to let go. The energy of the LaLaurie era is so potent that even the local animals refuse to go near the building after sunset. Dogs will howl at the empty windows, and horses will balk at the corner of Hospital Street. It is a physical manifestation of a trauma that has become a permanent part of the geography. The ghosts of the victims are not looking for revenge. They are simply looking for a witness to the suffering that the world tried to ignore for so long. The mansion stands as a testament to the fact that horror doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it is born right in the center of the world's most elegant neighborhoods. Delphine lived as a queen and fled as a demon, leaving a legacy of blood that the rain of Louisiana can never wash away. It is a house that waits for the next person to listen to the whispers in the attic, a place where the past is never finished and the shadows are always hungry. Story 7. The Cecil Hotel. The air inside the lobby of the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles does not feel like the sunny, salt-scented breeze of the California coast just a few miles away. It feels heavy, stagnant, and carries a thick, cloying odor of industrial-strength bleach, old cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic tang of rusted iron pipes. When you stand in front of the massive gold-leafed elevators, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure. You hear a sound that isn't the city traffic outside, but a low, rhythmic grinding of the elevator cables behind the heavy metal doors, a sound that feels like a slow, mechanical groan. The texture of the air is thick and slightly greasy, leaving a bitter chemical taste in the back of your throat that makes you want to wash your mouth out. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the very walls of the building are leaning in to listen to your heartbeat. When you walk down the long, dimly lit hallways of the 4th floor, the world feels narrow and oppressive. You feel the cool, slick moisture of the condensation on the wallpaper, and the smell of stagnant water begins to overpower the scent of the cleaners. You hear a distant, hollow metallic click that seems to come from a door closing by itself at the end of the hall. The carpet under your feet is worn and thin, muffling your footsteps until you feel like a ghost. In January of 2013, a 21-year-old student named Elisa Lamb was exactly where a young traveler seeking adventure was supposed to be. She was a bright, energetic woman from Vancouver, Canada, who had decided to take a solo trip down the west coast of the United States. She was a person who valued her independence and the thrill of seeing new cities. She was exactly where a tourist belonged, checking into a historic hotel in the heart of the city. Elisa was a woman of deep curiosity and a vibrant digital nature. At 21, she was known for her thoughtful blog posts and her ability to find beauty in the chaos of urban life. She wasn't just a traveler, she was a chronicler of her own journey, someone who wanted to experience the grit and the glamour of Los Angeles. She was a healthy, intelligent person who lived in a world of social media and tangible goals, seemingly shielded by her youth from the dark history. She was the kind of person who understood that the Cecil Hotel was a place with a complicated reputation, but she viewed it as an affordable and interesting base for her explorations. She found comfort in the predictable rhythm of her travel schedule, the way the morning light hit the skyscrapers, and the sound of the city waking up outside her window. She was a happy person who lived in a world of plans and maps, unaware that the hotel was a vortex of human misery. Tonight, I am going to tell you a story about a place that has seen more than its fair share of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. But before we get into our case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to take the like button for a luxury stay in a penthouse suite, but the second it tries to order room service, I want you to cut the phone line and lock the door from the outside as you leave the building forever. Also, if you would not mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. We really do appreciate all the support you guys give to the channel. It means a lot to the team here. Now, let us get into our story. The ritual of staying at the Cecil followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of urban survival that occupied Elisa's entire final week. Every single morning at 8 o'clock, Elisa would begin the long process of her daily routine. It started with her communications. She would spend nearly an hour in the lobby or a local cafe using her laptop to update her blog and check in with her parents back in Canada. She would move in slow, deliberate motions, her fingers clicking on the keys as she described the sights of the city. She had to be careful to ensure her parents knew she was safe every day. She would then head to the local bookstores and museums. She would spend the middle of the day walking through the crowded streets of the fashion district, her heavy boots thudding on the sidewalk in a rhythmic beat. She had to navigate the complex social landscape of Skid Row, a slow and very silent labor of observation and caution. She liked the mechanical certainty of the city's grid, the way the buses and the trains moved like precise parts of a massive machine. In the late afternoon, Elisa would return to the hotel to rest before dinner. This was the part of the day that she found most isolating. She would walk through the grand lobby, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. She would spend hours in her small room, the smell of the old wood and the sound of the traffic outside filling the quiet air. She took pride in her ability to travel alone, providing herself with a sense of perfect independence in the world. She would spend the final hour of her day recording her thoughts in her journal, her handwriting very precise and hopeful. She liked the order of it, the way the words on the page reflected the solid reality of her trip. She was a student who felt safe in her logic, believing that as long as she stayed aware of her surroundings, she would be protected from anything the city could offer. It was a perfect, mundane life in a historic building that was built for the travelers. But by the end of January, the mundane rhythm of the hotel began to shift in a way that would lead to a terror that captivated the entire world. The subtle shift happened when the hotel staff noticed that Elisa hadn't checked out on her scheduled date. They went to her room and found all of her belongings still there, but Elisa was nowhere to be found. The air in the hallways didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. The police were called, and they began a massive search of the 14-story building. They used search dogs and reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage. The atmosphere in the Cecil changed. The rhythmic sound of the elevators began to sound like a countdown, a slow grinding that echoed through the rooms. They found a video of Elisa in one of the elevators that was so bizarre it went viral globally, showing her behaving in a way that defied all logic. In the video, Elisa is seen entering the elevator and pressing multiple buttons. When the doors refuse to close, she begins to peek out into the hallway, jumping back and forth as if she is playing a game or hiding from someone who isn't there. She waves her hands in strange, fluid motions, her fingers splayed out like she is casting a spell. The air in the video seems thick, and the shadows in the hallway stay fixed and dark, regardless of the light in the car. The shift became physical for the other guests in the hotel over the next 2 weeks. People staying on the upper floors began to complain to the front desk about the water pressure. They said the water was coming out of the faucets in a weak, irregular stream. But the most disturbing part was the quality of the water itself. Guests reported that the water was coming out with a dark brownish tint and had a foul metallic taste that made them gag when they brushed. You are standing in a small bathroom on the 11th floor of the Cecil Hotel in February of 2013. You are a guest who has just returned from a long day of sightseeing. You turn on the shower, and the first thing you notice is the smell. It is a cloying, sweet odor of rotting meat and wet iron. You look down at the tub, and you see that the water is almost black. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the water is trying to tell. Do you turn off the tap and call the manager, knowing that they have been ignoring the complaints for days? Do you try to use the water anyway, telling yourself that it is just the old pipes of a historic building? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the hotel and realize that the taste in your mouth is not rust, but something that was once living? Because here is the thing. The guests at the Cecil had been drinking, bathing, and cooking with that water. The bizarre reveal came on the morning of February 19th. A maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez went to the roof to check the 4 massive water tanks that supplied the building. He climbed a ladder and opened the hatch to the first tank. He looked inside and saw a sight that made his heart stop. Elisa Lam was floating face down in the water, her body bloated and her clothing floating nearby. She had been inside the sealed tank for nearly 3 weeks. The mystery of how she got there remains one of the most debated cases in history. The roof was protected by a locked door and an alarm system that would have alerted the front desk. The water tank itself was over 8 feet tall, and the heavy metal lid would have been nearly impossible for a single small woman to close from the inside. Even more disturbing, the autopsy found no evidence of drugs or physical trauma, leaving the cause of her death a mystery. But Elisa was just the latest in a long line of tragedies at the Cecil. In the 1980s, the infamous serial killer Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, stayed at the hotel during his murder spree. He would return to the Cecil after a killing covered in blood and throw his clothes into the dumpsters in the alley before walking into the lobby in his underwear. No one questioned him because the hotel was already a place where the dark was the norm. Another serial killer, Jack Unterweger, stayed at the Cecil in 1991 while he was working as a journalist. He murdered 3 women during his stay, using the hotel as a base for his own twisted games. The building has been the site of at least 16 suicides and dozens of unsolved murders over the decades. It is as if the Cecil is a living organism that feeds on the despair of the people who enter, creating a vortex of misery that never truly sleeps. Today, the Cecil Hotel has been rebranded and renovated, but the energy of the past remains etched into the very bricks of the building. Visitors report seeing a woman in a red jacket walking through the hallways and hearing the sound of a heavy lid slamming shut on the roof in the middle of the night. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused dread, a place where the shadows are always hungry. It is a monument to the darkness that can hide in a city of light. Elisa Lamb was a woman who just wanted to see the world, but she learned that some buildings have a memory that survives long after the guests have checked out. She is a reminder that the energy we leave behind can become a presence that survives long after our names are forgotten. The Cecil stands as a silent witness to a history written in blood and black water, a place where the elevators go to floors that don't exist and the silence is never truly empty. The Hotel of Los Angeles proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the years, anchoring souls to the very rooms where their lives were stolen. But as the shadows continue to move through the hallways of California, thousands of miles away in the dark forests of Germany, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a massive hospital complex. It is a place where a dictator was once treated and where the ghosts of war still walk the wards. Story 8. Belitz Heilstätten Hospital, the lungs of Berlin. The air inside the abandoned surgery wing of the Belitz Heilstätten Hospital does not feel like the fresh, pine-scented breeze of the surrounding German forest. It feels incredibly heavy, stagnant, and carries a thick, cloying odor of rusted iron, pulverized limestone, and the faint, sweet scent of ether that has been trapped in the peeling walls for over 100 years. When you stand in the center of the massive tiled operating room, the silence is not a peaceful quiet. It is a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your very teeth, a silence that seems to be holding its breath as if it is waiting for the next patient to arrive. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but the low, rhythmic scratching of a tree branch against a broken window, a sound that echoes through the empty wards like a heartbeat. The texture of the air is thick and slightly gritty, leaving a fine layer of gray dust on your skin and a bitter chemical taste. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the oxygen is being replaced by the weight of the thousands of souls who died here during 2 world wars. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes every step feel like you are walking through water. You hear a distant, hollow metallic click that seems to come from an old iron bed frame moving by itself in the darkness. It is a sensory warning that you are in a place where the living were once just numbers. In the autumn of 1916, a 27-year-old nurse named Greta was exactly where a dedicated healer was supposed to be. She was a woman of immense compassion, high skill, and an unwavering commitment to the soldiers of the German army. She was a person of solid character who valued the order of the medical world. She was exactly where a professional belonged, working in the massive hospital complex that was known as the lungs of the city of Berlin. Greta was a woman of quiet observation and deep intellect. At 27, she was known for her steady hand and her ability to remain calm while the world outside was being torn apart by the Great War. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a witness to the human cost of conflict. She loved the technical side of her work, the bandages, the thermometers, and the precise measurements of the medicine. She was a healthy, disciplined person who lived in a world of protocol. She was the kind of person who understood that the Belitz Heilstätten was more than just a hospital. It was a self-contained city designed to cure the sick with fresh air and sunlight. She found comfort in the predictable rhythm of her shifts, the way the morning light hit the red brick walls, and the sound of the steam pipes hissing in the corridors. She was a happy person who lived in a world of facts and figures, seemingly shielded by her duty from any darkness. The ritual of patient care at the hospital followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of observations and treatments that occupied Greta's entire day for years. Every single morning at 5 o'clock, she would begin the long process of the morning rounds. It started with the laundry. She would spend nearly 2 hours in the basement using a heavy wooden paddle to stir the white linens in the boiling water. She would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the steam. She would then head to the 4th floor, the ward for the most advanced cases of tuberculosis. She would walk into each room, offering a kind word to the soldiers who were too weak to sit up. She would take their temperature, cleaning the glass tube with a cloth soaked in alcohol before placing it under their tongues. She had to wait exactly 3 minutes for each reading, a slow and silent labor that required her absolute focus. She recorded the numbers in a ledger. In the late afternoon, Greta would begin the nutrition rounds. This was the part of the day that she found most rewarding. She would carry heavy metal trays of warm broth and fresh bread to the bedside of each patient. She would sit with them, talking about the weather in the forest or the letters they had received from home. She took immense pride in her role as their primary caregiver, knowing that for many of them, she was the only friendly face they would see today. She would spend the final hour of her shift cleaning the surgical instruments, using a small wire brush to scrub the metal trays until they were free of any stains. She liked the order of it, the way the sterile environment felt like a shield against the inevitable decay of the world. She was a nurse who felt safe in her duty, believing that as long as she followed the rules of the doctors, she was doing the right thing. It was a perfect, mundane life in a grand place. But by the winter of 1916, the mundane rhythm of the hospital began to shift in a way that made Greta's skin crawl. The subtle shift happened when she was assigned to care for a young corporal who had been wounded in the leg at the Battle of the Somme. He was a quiet, intense man with a dark mustache and eyes that seemed to burn with a strange, focused hatred. His name was Adolf, and he spent his days staring at the ceiling and whispering to himself. Greta began to notice that the air in Adolf's room was getting much colder than the rest of the ward, even with the coal heaters running at full capacity. The air didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. She heard a sound from the corner of the room, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a person in heavy boots pacing back and forth on the floorboards. The atmosphere in the wing changed. Her own heart was loud in her ears. The shift became even more pronounced during her night shifts in the surgery wing. Greta started finding the shadows in the long hallways, behaving in ways that defied the laws of physics. She would be walking toward the pharmacy with a lantern, and she would see a small shadow, the size of a grown man, standing directly behind her in the reflection of the floor tiles. She would turn around, but the hallway would be completely empty and silent for hundreds of yards. She began to notice that the patients who died in the middle of the night weren't just being taken to the morgue. She would hear the sound of the heavy service elevator descending at 3 o'clock in the morning, a slow, grinding, mechanical groan that echoed through the stone building. The smell of ether became so thick in the corridors that it was hard to breathe. She realized that the hospital was starting to feel like a factory that was consuming the very men it saved. The shift became physical for Greta in December. She was cleaning the operating room alone when she felt a sudden, sharp pressure on her shoulder. She turned around, expecting to see a doctor, but there was no one there. She looked down at her white uniform and saw 3 distinct red handprints appearing on the fabric. They weren't just stains, they were warm to the touch, as if an invisible person had just grabbed her. She felt a coldness that reached her soul. You are standing in that dark, cold surgery wing in 1916. You are Greta, and you have just realized that the hospital is not just a place of healing. You hear a sound from the operating table, a low, wet whisper that calls your name. You turn your lantern toward the table and you see a sight that makes your heart stop. The instruments you just cleaned are moving by themselves, vibrating on the metal tray with a rhythmic, clinking sound that gets louder. Do you stay and try to finish your work, knowing that the rules of the hospital demand that everything be sterile before the morning? Do you try to run for the exit, knowing that the guards will report you for abandoning your post during a time of war? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the forest outside and realize that the building has already claimed you? Because here is the thing, Greta didn't leave. She stayed in the hospital until the very end of the war. The bizarre reveal came decades later, long after the hospital had been abandoned. In the 1990s, a man who became known as the Bielitz Beast used the ruins of the hospital as his hunting ground. He was a serial killer who murdered several people inside the decaying wards, leaving their bodies in the same rooms where the soldiers had once been treated. He claimed that the building told him to do it, that the walls were hungry for the blood of the living. Even more disturbing, investigators found that the hospital had been used by the Soviet army after the Second World War to perform horrific psychological experiments on their own soldiers. They discovered hidden rooms in the basement where the walls were padded and the floor was covered in iron rings. The energy of the trauma from 2 world wars, a dictator's recovery, and a serial killer's spree has created a vortex of misery that never truly sleeps in the dark. Today, Bielitz-Heilstätten remains one of the most haunted locations in Germany, a place where the past is always just a shadow away. Visitors report seeing a nurse in a white uniform walking through the walls of the surgery wing and hearing the sound of a man screaming in a room that has no door. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused dread. It serves as a haunting reminder that a building can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries. Greta was a woman who believed in the safety of her duty, but she learned that the greatest darkness can sometimes hide in a place that is designed for light. She is a reminder that the energy we leave behind can become a presence that survives long after our names are forgotten. The hospital stands as a silent witness to a history written in blood and ether, a place where the lungs of Berlin have stopped breathing, but the heart of the building is still beating. The ruins of Germany proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the years, anchoring souls to the very rooms where their lives were spent in pain. But as the shadows continue to move through the wards of Belitz, thousands of miles away in the city of Philadelphia, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a massive stone fortress. It is a prison where the concept of solitary confinement was born, and where the walls have ears. Story 9. Eastern State Penitentiary, the System of Silence. The air inside the damp, high-walled corridors of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia does not feel like the busy urban atmosphere of the city just outside the gates. It feels incredibly heavy, ancient, and carries a thick, cloying odor of wet limestone, rusted iron, and the faint, sweet scent of unwashed bodies that has been trapped in the stone for nearly 200 years. When you stand in the center of the radial hub, the silence is not peaceful. It is a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your very teeth, a silence that was designed to force a man to look into his own soul until he went mad. You hear a sound that isn't the city traffic, but the low, rhythmic dripping of water hitting a concrete floor, a sound that echoes through the long, narrow cell blocks like a constant ticking clock. The texture of the air is thick and slightly gritty, leaving a fine layer of gray dust on your skin and a bitter taste. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the massive granite walls are leaning in to listen to your very thoughts. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes every step feel like you are walking through thick mud. You hear a distant, hollow, metallic scraping that seems to come from an iron gate sliding open by itself in a block that has been empty for decades. It is a sensory warning that you are in a place where the walls have ears and the shadows talk. In the spring of 1942, a 35-year-old prison guard named Frank was exactly where a disciplined professional with a young family was supposed to be. He was a steady, hard-working man who had just secured a position at one of the most famous and imposing correctional facilities in the world. He was a person of solid character who valued the order of the law. He was exactly where a provider belonged, walking the tiers of the massive stone fortress. Frank was a man of quiet observation and deep physical stamina. At 35, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to remain calm while guarding some of the most dangerous men in Pennsylvania. He wasn't just a guard, he was a student of human behavior, someone who understood that the prison was a machine that required every gear to move in perfect synchronization. He loved the routine of his work and the shared brotherhood with his fellow officers. He was the kind of person who understood that Eastern State was more than just a jail, it was a grand experiment in the power of silence and solitude. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his shifts, the way the morning light hit the high-vaulted ceilings, and the sound of the master keys clinking against his belt. He was a happy person who lived in a world of tangible reality, seemingly shielded by his badge from any darkness. He was just a normal guy. The ritual of the night shift followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of security checks that occupied Frank's entire 12-hour block. Every single evening at 6 o'clock, he would begin the long process of the first count. It started with the heavy brass keys. He would spend nearly 45 minutes in the central hub, checking every single key against his ledger. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the cold weight of the metal in his palm each time. He would then head to the cell blocks. He would walk the entire length of the tier, his heavy boots thudding on the concrete in a rhythmic beat. He had to be careful to look through the small eye hole of every single wooden door, a slow and very silent labor that required his absolute focus. He would spend nearly 2 hours checking the latches and the hinges, ensuring that the silence of the prison was never broken. He liked the mechanical certainty of the work. In the late evening, Frank would begin the meal delivery rounds. This was the part of the shift that required the most discipline. He would push a heavy metal cart filled with tin trays through the narrow hallways. He would slide each tray through a small slot at the bottom of the door, never speaking a single word to the inmates inside. He took immense pride in his role as a guardian of the system, knowing that his vigilance was the only thing keeping the order. One of the cells Frank checked every night was cell number 1 on the second tier of cell block 10. This was the cell of the famous gangster Al Capone, who stayed there in 1929. Unlike the other cold bare cells, this one was filled with fine oriental rugs, oil paintings, and a massive mahogany desk. Frank would spend 10 minutes standing outside that door, listening to the classical music playing on the radio inside. It was a bizarre pocket of luxury. Frank also had to check the exercise yards, where the most unusual inmate in the history of the prison once stayed. This was a black Labrador retriever named Pep, who had been sentenced to life in prison in 1924 for allegedly killing a cat belonging to the governor's wife. Frank would look at the small, empty yard and imagine the dog sitting in the silence, a victim of the same system that was designed to break the will of the most violent men. He would spend the final hour of his shift recording the results in a thick, leather-bound logbook, ensuring that every detail was documented with a steady hand. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect control and stability. He felt safe within the massive stone walls, believing that as long as he followed the protocols of the silent system, he was doing the right thing. It was a perfect, mundane life in a place built for the quiet. But as the clock reached 3:15 on a Tuesday morning in 1945, the mundane rhythm of his shift began to shift in a way that made Frank's blood turn to ice. The subtle shift happened when he was assigned to conduct a sweep of cell block 12, a place that was supposed to be completely empty of both guards and inmates. The air in the block didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of ancient and deep dread. He began to feel an overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that were level with his own, even though he was the only living thing in the long hallway. He noticed that the shadows in the corner of the block weren't moving with his flashlight beam. They stayed fixed and dark, even when he pointed the light directly at them. He heard a sound from the end of the tier, a rhythmic tapping like a person with long fingernails hitting the stone over and over again. The shift became even more pronounced when Frank reached the center of the block. He looked at the white concrete wall and saw a silhouette that wasn't his own. It was a mass of pure, concentrated darkness that looked like a man wearing a ragged prison uniform from the 1800s. The figure didn't have a face, only 2 pits where the eyes should be. Frank blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the low light, but the shadow moved toward him in a lunge. He felt a sudden, sharp draft of air hit his chest, and the smell of ozone and wet copper filled the room. He didn't see a physical person with his own eyes, but his gut was screaming at him that he was in the presence of something ancient and predatory that had been birthed by the silence. He tried to reach for his radio, but his hand felt like it was made of lead. The shadow man stopped just inches from him, and Frank felt a coldness that reached into his very soul and his bones. You are standing in that dark, cold cell block in 1945. You are Frank, a man who has faced the most violent criminals in the state without blinking. You have a heavy flashlight and a ring of keys, but they feel like toys in the face of the darkness in front of you. You hear a sound in the dark, a low, wet growl that isn't human. You realize that you are in a place where the rules of the living don't apply. You are paralyzed by a primal and deep fear. You look down at the floor and you see that your shadow is being pulled away from your feet, as if the ground itself is trying to steal your identity. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure on your throat, and the smell of wet sulfur and old stone fills your lungs. You try to scream for the guards in the hub, but the silence of the prison is absolute and suffocating. You are a prisoner of the stone, and the thing in front of you is the warden of this dark and silent world. Do you try to call for backup, knowing that the other guards will think you are losing your mind? Do you try to shine your light at the shadow, hoping that the brightness will make it vanish into the stone? Or do you listen to that voice in your head that tells you that this prison has absorbed so much misery and silence that it has birthed its own monster? Because here's the thing, Frank didn't wait to find out. He backed out of the block, his eyes never leaving it. How do you explain the fact that a man can walk into a building and lose his sense of reality in a matter of minutes? Is it possible that the human mind is so fragile that it can be broken by the simple absence of sound? Because the philosophy of Eastern State was built on the idea that silence was a path to redemption, but for many it was a path to something much darker. You have to ask yourself if the walls were built to keep the men in, or to keep the darkness out. The bizarre reveal came when Frank talked to a veteran locksmith who had worked at the prison for 30 years. The locksmith didn't laugh. He told Frank about a night in the 1920s when he was repairing a lock on cell block 12. He said that as he removed the plate, a face appeared in the hole where the lock had been. It wasn't a human face, but a twisted, screaming mask of agony that vanished the second he blinked. He had quit the very next morning. It turned out that hundreds of guards and inmates had seen the same shadow figures for decades. The Pennsylvania system of total solitary confinement had been so effective at breaking the human spirit that it had created a physical residue of madness that stayed in the walls. The prison was designed to make men reflect on their sins, but it had instead created a place where the darkness could manifest and feed on the fear of anyone who walked the empty tiers. Frank stayed at Eastern State until he retired, but he never stepped foot in cell block 12 again. The prison was closed in 1971 and stood abandoned for decades, becoming a forest of stone and weeds in the middle of Philadelphia. Today, it is a world-famous tourist attraction where people pay to walk the same hallways Frank once guarded. Visitors report seeing the same shadow man and hearing the sound of a man weeping in Al Capone's cell. Eastern State remains a hulking, Gothic monument to a failed experiment in the architecture of the mind. It is a place where the energy of thousands of broken men is etched into every granite block. It serves as a haunting reminder that silence is not always a sign of peace. Sometimes it is the sound of a monster being born in the dark. The prison stands as a silent witness to a history written in isolation and the deep, eternal memory of the stone walls. The prison of Philadelphia proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring souls to the very cells where their minds were broken. But as the shadows continue to move through the tiers of Eastern State, thousands of miles away in the sunny city of San Diego, California, there is a place where the hauntings are not tied to a prison, but to a family home. It is a house where the sound of heavy boots never stops walking. This is the Whaley House, a place built on the site of a public execution where the ghosts are not just seen, but heard and felt in the middle of a peaceful afternoon. It is a house where the history of the town and the trauma of a family have merged into a single, terrifying entity that refuses to let the living live in peace. The mystery is not just who is walking the halls, but why they are so determined to be seen by everyone who enters the front door. Story 10. The Whaley House, the Courtroom of the Dead. The air in the sun-drenched garden of the Whaley House in Old Town San Diego does not feel like the fresh, salt-scented breeze of the Pacific Ocean just a few miles away. It feels heavy, stagnant, and carries a thick, cloying odor of stale cigar smoke, old lavender perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of rusted iron that has been baked into the wooden floorboards for over 160 years. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest as you step inside. When you stand in the archway between the living room and the music room, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure that you feel in your very teeth. You hear a sound that is not the wind, but the low, rhythmic thudding of heavy boots walking across the floorboards upstairs, a sound that makes the crystal chandeliers vibrate with a faint metallic clinking. The texture of the air is thick and slightly gritty, leaving a bitter taste in your mouth. You feel a sudden, icy draft that doesn't come from a window, but seems to rise directly from the floorboards where a man once fought for his final breath. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes every step feel like you are walking through thick water. You hear a distant, hollow, metallic click that seems to come from an old door latch moving by itself in the darkness. It is a sensory warning that you are in a place where the dead have never truly left the rooms. In the spring of 1857, a 33-year-old man named Thomas Whaley was exactly where a successful entrepreneur in the growing territory of California was supposed to be. He was a wealthy businessman, a respected member of the community, and a father who had just finished building the finest brick mansion in Southern California. He was exactly where a provider belonged, standing in his own grand home, surrounded by a beautiful wife and healthy children. Thomas Whaley was a man of quiet observation and immense physical stamina. At 33, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to build a commercial empire from the ground up. He wasn't just a homeowner, he was a pioneer who understood the value of property and the necessity of order. He loved the technical side of his work, the bricks, the mortar, and the way the sun hit the balcony in the late afternoon. He was a healthy, disciplined man of the world. He was the kind of person who understood that the Whaley House was more than just a home. It was a center of civilization that housed a general store, a granary, and even the city's first commercial theater. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his life, the way the morning light hit the mahogany furniture and the sound of his children playing in the yard. He was a happy person who lived in a world of tangible reality, seemingly shielded by his great success. The ritual of managing the grand estate followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of business and domestic duties that occupied Thomas's entire day for many years. Every single morning at 6 o'clock, he would begin the long process of opening the general store on the first floor. It started with the shutters. He would spend nearly 30 minutes unbolting the heavy wooden panels, feeling the rough texture of the grain and the smell of the salt air on the ancient wood. He would then move to the inventory. He would spend the middle of the day walking through the rows of canned goods, dry fabric, and iron tools, his heavy leather shoes thudding on the floorboards in a rhythmic beat. He had to ensure that the supplies for the growing town were exactly where they needed to be, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. He liked the mechanical certainty of the commerce, the way the coins clinked in the heavy metal till. In the late afternoon, the family would gather in the music room. This was the part of the day that Thomas found most rewarding. His wife, Anna, would sit at the piano, the sound of the keys filling the air like a constant, beautiful wind. He would sit in a leather chair, watching the shadows of the garden grow long across the floor. He took immense pride in his role as the master of the house, knowing that his work was providing a legacy for his entire growing family. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the business transactions in a heavy leather-bound ledger, ensuring that every cent was documented with a steady hand. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe within the brick walls, believing that as long as he focused on the physical reality of his success, the world would remain stable. It was a perfect, mundane life in a place built for the living. But even before the Whaley family moved into the house, the mundane rhythm of their life began to shift in a way that made their blood run cold. The subtle shift happened when Thomas was still supervising the construction of the brick walls. He began to hear a sound that was not a worker's hammer or the wind. It was the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps pacing back and forth on the second floor, even though there were no stairs yet installed in the new building. He began to feel an overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that were level with his own, even when he was completely alone in the unfinished rooms. The air in the house didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. He heard a sound from the backyard, a low, rhythmic creaking like a heavy rope stretching under a massive weight. The atmosphere in the mansion changed. The sound of his own heart was loud in his ears. The shift became even more pronounced when Thomas Jr., the family's 18-month-old son, died of scarlet fever just a few months after they moved in. The joy of the house was replaced by a crushing silence. Then, a few years later, a young woman named Violet Whaley, overwhelmed by a failed marriage and the weight of the family's grief, took her own life in the garden. The air in the hallways didn't just feel cool, it became a vacuum of permanent and deep sorrow. The shift became physical for the family in 1869. They started seeing a tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway of the master bedroom. It wasn't a blur or a trick of the light, it was a mass of pure, concentrated darkness that looked like a man wearing the clothes of a common laborer. He didn't have a face, only a presence that radiated a sense of absolute and ancient anger. The family began to call him Yankee Jim, and he refused to leave the rooms. You are standing in that dark, cold music room in 1885. You are a visitor to the house, and you have just noticed that the piano has started playing by itself. You see the keys moving in a rhythmic, haunting melody, but there is no one on the stool. Suddenly, the air goes freezing, and the smell of thick cigar smoke fills the room. You hear a sound from the stairs, a heavy, deliberate thud, thud, thud of boots that makes the floorboards under your feet. You look up, and you see a tall man with a dark beard standing at the top of the landing. He isn't moving, he is just staring down at you with eyes that look like two pits of empty, swirling smoke. You try to turn around and run for the front door, but your legs feel like they are made of lead. You hear a sound in your ear, a low, wet whisper that tells you that you are standing on his gallows. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure on your neck that makes it hard to breathe. How do you explain the fact that a house can hold on to a trauma that happened before the foundation was even laid? Is it possible that the earth itself has a memory of the blood that was spilled upon it? Because Thomas Whaley didn't just build a house, he built a monument on top of a public execution site. You have to ask yourself if you would be able to sleep at night knowing that the archway in your living room was the exact spot where a man was hanged in the sun. Do you try to rationalize the sounds as the old wood expanding in the California heat? Or do you listen to the rhythmic pattern of the footsteps and realize they are too deliberate to be a coincidence? Do you tell yourself that the smell of the perfume is just a remnant of the past? Or do you admit that you are sharing your home with people who died over a century ago? Because the Whaley family didn't leave. They stayed and learned to live with the shadows every night. The bizarre reveal came when they looked into the history of the lot where the house was built. In 1852, 5 years before the house existed, a man named James Robinson, known as Yankee Jim, was convicted of grand larceny for stealing a boat. He was led to a makeshift gallows that stood exactly where the Whaley House kitchen and archway are today. Because the gallows were too short, Yankee Jim didn't die instantly. He swung for 45 minutes. He strangled to death in a slow and horrific way while a crowd watched in silence. The energy of that prolonged and violent death was absorbed by the very soil and later by the bricks of the house. Yankee Jim didn't just haunt the family, he claimed the territory as his own. Even more disturbing, the house later served as the San Diego County Courthouse, a place where more men were sentenced to death in the same rooms where the Whaley children played and slept. Today, the Whaley House is officially designated by the United States Commerce Department as the most haunted house in America. It is a world-famous museum where the past is always just a shadow away. Visitors report seeing the ghost of Anna Whaley in the garden and hearing the sound of a baby crying in the nursery. The energy of the executions and the family's grief is etched into the very grain of the wood. It serves as a haunting reminder of the violent past. The house remains a place of profound mystery and ancient dread, where the barrier between the living and the dead is as thin as a sheet of paper. People who work there report being touched by invisible hands and seeing the chandeliers swing violently on windless days. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused pressure. It is a monument to a history written in blood and law, a place where the courtroom of the dead is always in session in the deep of the night. The Whaley House proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring souls to the very floorboards where they took their final breath. But as the heavy boots of Yankee Jim continue to thud through the halls of San Diego, thousands of miles away in the deep mossy bayous of Louisiana, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a massive plantation. It is a place where a single mirror holds the souls of a poisoned family. Story 11. The Myrtles Plantation, the Mirror of Souls. The air in the humid lowlands of St. Francisville, Louisiana, does not feel like the fresh, floral breeze of a typical southern morning. It feels heavy, wet, and carries a thick, cloying odor of stagnant swamp water, damp Spanish moss, and the faint, metallic tang of old iron that has been rusted by a century of heat. When you stand beneath the massive, gnarled branches of the live oaks, the silence is not a peaceful quiet, but a dense, vibrating pressure. You hear a sound that is not the wind, but a low, rhythmic rustling of the moss hitting the wooden porch, a sound that feels like a slow, ghostly whisper. The texture of the air is thick and slightly sticky, leaving a fine layer of moisture on your skin and a bitter, earthy taste in the back of your throat that makes you want to wipe your face. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the very trees are leaning in to listen to your heartbeat in the dark. You feel a sudden, icy draft that doesn't come from a storm, but seems to rise directly from the floorboards of the grand veranda. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes every step feel like you are walking through invisible cobwebs. You hear a distant, hollow, metallic click that seems to come from an old iron gate moving by itself in the distance. It is a sensory warning that you are in a place where the shadows are more than just a lack of light. In 1817, a 30-year-old man named Judge Clark Woodruff was exactly where a successful professional in the Louisiana Territory is supposed to be. He was a brilliant legal mind, a wealthy landowner, and a father who lived in the grand mansion known as the Myrtles. He was exactly where a provider belonged, standing in his own library, surrounded by his beautiful wife Sarah and their 2 young daughters. He was a person of solid logic and high status. Judge Woodruff was a man of quiet observation and immense intellectual stamina. At 30 years old, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to navigate the complex social landscape of the plantation South. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a leader who understood the value of land and the necessity of absolute order. He loved the technical side of his work, the legal books, the ledgers, and the way the morning light hit the mahogany desk in his office. The ritual of managing the grand plantation followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of agricultural and domestic duties that occupied the entire day for Judge Woodruff. Every single morning at 6 o'clock, he would begin the long process of reviewing the cotton production reports. It started with the ledgers. He would spend nearly 2 hours in his library using a fine quill pen to record the weights of the bales. He would move in slow, deliberate, and steady motions. He would then move to the fields. He would spend the middle of the day walking through the rows of white cotton, his heavy leather boots thudding on the dry earth in a rhythmic beat. He had to ensure that the harvest was progressing according to his strict schedule, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. He liked the mechanical certainty of the plantation's operations, the way the workers and the machinery moved like precise parts of a massive machine. The judge would spend the final hour of his morning walk inspecting the horses in the stable. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the warm, rhythmic breathing of the animals and the smell of the fresh hay and the oiled leather. He had to ensure that the transport for his family was always in perfect condition, a slow and silent labor of safety that he took very seriously. He liked the mechanical certainty of the stable, the way the horses were a sign of power. In the late afternoon, the family would gather in the dining room for tea. This was the part of the day that the judge found most rewarding. His wife Sarah would sit at the head of the table, the sound of the silver spoons clinking against the china filling the quiet air. He would sit in a high-backed chair, watching the shadows of the oaks grow long across the floor. He took immense pride in his role as the master of the house, providing a legacy for his entire family. One of the house slaves who worked most closely with the family was a woman named Chloe. She was a trusted member of the household staff, responsible for the care of the children and the preparation of the light meals. She would spend her afternoons cleaning the silver and dusting the ornate mirrors that lined the long hallway. She moved in slow, quiet motions, her footsteps barely making a sound on the rugs. She was a person who understood the order of the mansion. In the late evening, the sounds of the bayou would drift through the open windows of the second floor. The croaking of the bullfrogs and the rhythmic chirping of the crickets created a dense, vibrating wall of sound that most people found peaceful. But for those in the big house, it was a reminder of the wild and unpredictable nature that surrounded their island of refinement. Judge Woodruff would sit on the balcony, enjoying a single glass of bourbon in the dark. Chloe would spend the final hour of her day recording the laundry needs in a small notebook, ensuring that every piece of lace and every linen shirt was documented for the wash. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided her with a sense of stability in a world of hard labor. She felt safe in the big house, believing that as long as she stayed invisible and efficient, she could survive. It was a perfect, mundane life in a place built for the wealthy and silent. But by the winter of 1824, the mundane rhythm of the house began to shift in a way that made the air feel thin. The subtle shift happened when Judge Woodruff caught Chloe eavesdropping on a private conversation in the library. He was a man of cold, explosive discipline, and as punishment, he ordered that one of Chloe's ears be cut off. The girl began to wear a green turban every day to hide the scar, and the silence of the house became heavy and stagnant. Chloe began to feel an overwhelming sensation of desperation. She wanted to regain her favor with the family, to show them that she was still essential to their happiness. She heard a sound from the garden, a low, rhythmic rustling of the oleander bushes. She decided to bake a special cake for a birthday party, but she added a small amount of the poisonous leaves to the batter. Her plan was to make them sick and then nurse them back to health with her own care. Chloe spent the night before the party in the small attic room, the shadows of the trees dancing on the walls like 1,000 fingers. She would touch the green silk of her turban, feeling the void where her ear used to be, a constant and rhythmic reminder of the judge's cruelty. She wasn't acting out of hatred, but out of a twisted, desperate need for the love and the protection of the family. She believed that the sickness would be a bridge back to her old life. The atmosphere in the kitchen changed. The rhythmic sound of the whisk against the bowl began to sound like a countdown. Chloe noticed that the shadows in the kitchen weren't moving with the sun anymore. They stayed fixed and dark, even in the heat of the afternoon. She felt a sudden, sharp draft of air on her neck, and the smell of the sweet cake was replaced by the scent of bitter almonds and wet iron. She realized she was walking on a path that had no return. You are standing in that grand dining room in 1824. You are Sarah Woodruff, and you are celebrating your daughter's birthday. You take a bite of the beautiful cake that Chloe has prepared, and the first thing you notice is a strange, bitter aftertaste. Within minutes, you feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, and the room begins to spin. You look at your two daughters, who are already clutching their stomachs and crying out in a sudden, sharp pain. You try to call for the judge, but your voice is caught in your throat. You feel a coldness that reaches into your very marrow. You look toward the doorway and you see Chloe standing there, her green turban bright against the shadows. She isn't helping, she is just watching with eyes that look like two pits of empty smoke. You realize that the woman you trusted has brought a darkness into the room that cannot be undone. You fall to the floor, the silver spoon clattering. How do you explain the fact that a single desperate act can destroy an entire family in a matter of hours? Is it possible that the human heart is so fragile that a perceived slight can lead to a mass murder? Because Chloe didn't mean to kill them. She just wanted to be needed again. You have to ask yourself if you would be able to live with the weight of that cake, knowing that every bite was a death sentence for the people who relied on you for their very comfort. Do you try to rationalize the tragedy as an accident of ignorance? Or do you listen to the rhythmic sobbing of the ghosts in the hallway and realize that some actions are unforgivable? Do you tell yourself that the house is just a building? Or do you admit that you are standing in a place where the energy of the betrayal is still active today? Because the other slaves on the plantation didn't wait for a trial. They took Chloe into the woods and they ended her life. The spirit of Chloe didn't leave the plantation after her body was thrown into the river. She stayed in the hallways, her green turban a flash of color in the dim light of the evening. She was seen by the next owners of the house, who reported that the smell of burning wood and oleander would suddenly fill a room for no reason. They found that the clocks in the house would stop at the exact time of the birthday party, a rhythmic and constant cycle of failure. The bizarre reveal came after the funeral. According to custom in the South, all mirrors in a house were covered with black cloth when someone died, to prevent their souls from becoming trapped in the glass. But on that day, one mirror in the main hallway was missed. The souls of Sarah and her daughters were said to have been pulled into the silver backing of the mirror. For nearly 200 years, guests have reported seeing small, ghostly handprints in the glass. These handprints cannot be washed away with any chemical or cleaner. They appear from the inside of the glass, a rhythmic pattern of small fingers and palms that seem to be pushing against the surface. People have seen a woman in a green turban wandering the veranda, her face a mask of eternal regret. The Myrtles is now known as one of the 10 most haunted houses in the country, a place where the mirrors tell a story of a poison that never truly left the mansion. The Myrtles is also home to a ghost, known as the Ghost Girl, who has been photographed standing in the window of the upper floor. She is a small, pale figure in a Victorian dress, staring out at the oak trees with a look of absolute and ancient longing. The atmosphere of the plantation remains one of heavy, focused dread, a place where the past is not a memory, but a physical presence. It is a monument to a tragedy that the soil of Louisiana refuses to bury. People who visit the plantation today report being pushed by invisible hands on the stairs and hearing the sound of small children laughing in the empty rooms. The mirror with the handprints remains the most famous artifact in the house, a constant and rhythmic reminder of the family that was lost to a single act of desperation. The energy of the Myrtles is so potent that even the local wildlife seems to avoid the house after the sun goes down in the deep night. The Myrtle stands as a silent monument to a history written in blood and betrayal, a place where the shadows of the oaks are long and the mirrors are never empty. It serves as a haunting reminder that a home can hold on to a trauma that survives long after the family is gone. But as the handprints continue to appear in the glass of Louisiana, thousands of miles away in San Jose, California, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to architectural madness. It is a house with stairways that lead to the ceiling and doors that open into a 3-story drop. It is a mansion built by a woman who believed that as long as the construction never stopped, the ghosts of the people killed by her family's rifles would never find her. Welcome to the Winchester Mystery House, where the shadows are built into the very design of the rooms. I have finished the 41st story now. Story 12, Winchester Mystery House, the architecture of guilt. The air inside the sprawling mansion in San Jose does not feel like the fresh, fruit-scented breeze of the Santa Clara Valley in 1884. It feels heavy, dry, and carries a thick, suffocating odor of fresh redwood sawdust, turpentine, and the faint, metallic tang of the thousands of brass nails being driven into the wood every single hour of the day and night. When you stand in the grand ballroom, the silence is not a peaceful or a quiet moment. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a constant rhythmic hammering coming from a dozen different directions at once, a sound that feels like a slow mechanical heartbeat of a house that never sleeps. The texture of the air is thick with a fine layer of white plaster dust that leaves a bitter, chalky taste in the back of your throat. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest as if the very walls are shifting their positions all around you in the dark. In 1881, a 41-year-old woman named Sarah Winchester was exactly where the wealthiest widow in America was supposed to be. She was a woman of immense intelligence, high social standing, and a fortune of over $20 million left to her by her husband, William, the heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. She was exactly where a lady belonged, living in a world of fine lace and absolute financial security. She was a solid person. Sarah was a woman of deep musical talent and a vibrant intellectual nature. At 41, she was known as a master of several languages and a person who understood the complex mechanics of the world. She was a sturdy, healthy person who took great pride in her home and her family legacy. She was a person who lived in a world of tangible facts and clear outcomes, seemingly shielded by her massive wealth from any real or lasting harm. She was a lady of high status. The ritual of managing the construction followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of architectural planning and manual labor that occupied Sarah's entire life for 38 years. Every single morning at 7 o'clock, she would begin the long process of reviewing the day's blueprints. It started with the sketches. She would spend nearly 3 hours in her private sitting room, using a fine pencil to draw doors that led to nowhere and windows built into the floors. She would then move to the work sites. She would spend the middle of the day walking through the unfinished wings, her heavy silk skirts rustling against the piles of timber and the iron tools. She had to ensure that the hammers never stopped for a single minute, a slow and silent labor of obsession that required her absolute focus. She liked the mechanical certainty of the construction, the way the house grew like a living organism in the hot California sun. But by the winter of 1884, the mundane rhythm of her life began to shift in a way that made the neighbors think she had lost her mind. The subtle shift happened when Sarah visited a medium in Boston after the deaths of her daughter and husband. The psychic told her that she was haunted by the spirits of every person killed by a Winchester rifle. The only way to appease them was to keep building a house for them that was never finished. She was trapped. She began to feel an overwhelming sensation of being watched by 1,000 eyes that were invisible to the rest of the world. She moved to California and purchased an 8-room farmhouse, immediately hiring a crew of 22 carpenters to work in shifts around the clock. The air in the house didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. She heard a sound from the hallway, a low, rhythmic whispering of the dead. You are standing in a narrow hallway on the 4th floor in 1905. You are Sarah Winchester, and you are wearing a heavy black veil to hide your face from the spirits. You reach for a door handle, but when you open it, there is no room behind it, only a sheer drop of 15 feet onto the kitchen floor below. You feel a sudden, sharp draft of air on your neck, and the smell of gunpowder and old wood fills your lungs in the deep and silent dark. You move to a set of stairs, but as you climb, you realize they lead directly into the flat plaster of the ceiling. You hear a sound behind you, a low, rhythmic thumping of thousands of phantom boots on the redwood boards. You feel a coldness that reaches into your very marrow. You realize that you are not the master of this house, but a prisoner of the architecture you created to hide from the ghosts of your family's violent and bloody success. You are truly lost. How do you explain the logic of a woman who believes that a labyrinth of wood and iron can trick a ghost? Is it possible that the human mind can be so consumed by guilt that it builds a physical representation of its own confusion? Because Sarah didn't build for comfort, she built for distraction. You have to ask yourself if you would be able to live in a house with 160 rooms, knowing that every single one was a cage for a memory of the dead, Do you try to rationalize the design as the eccentric hobby of a wealthy widow, or do you listen to the rhythmic hammering in the night and realize it was a desperate attempt to stay alive? Do you tell yourself that the house is just a building, or do you admit that you are standing in a place where the architecture of madness is still active today? Because the hammers never stopped until the very moment Sarah's heart gave out in the middle of a very quiet night. The bizarre reveal came after Sarah's death in 1922. The carpenters literally dropped their tools in the middle of driving nails when they heard the news. When the estate was surveyed, they found a house that defied every law of construction. They found a seance room with 13 coat hooks for the spirits and a bathroom with 13 windows. They found secret passages that only Sarah knew, used to move through the house without being seen by guests. Even more disturbing, they discovered that Sarah had spent over $5 million on a building that had no master plan. The house had grown to 7 stories before the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906 brought it down to 4. The energy of the obsession was so potent that the neighbors claimed they could still hear the sound of the hammers for months after the house was closed. It was a factory of fear that was built to last forever. Today, the Winchester Mystery House is a world-famous tourist attraction where people still get lost in the maze of hallways. Visitors report seeing a man in overalls carrying a toolbox and hearing the sound of a woman sobbing in the seance room. The energy of Sarah's guilt is etched into the very redwood of the mansion. It serves as a haunting reminder that the ghosts of the past cannot be outrun, even with a fortune of gold and 1,000 busy hammers. The house in San Jose proved that a location can hold on to a malice and a madness that survives through the years, anchoring a spirit to the very rooms she built to escape them. But as the silence finally settles over the Winchester estate, thousands of miles away in the rugged mountains of Transylvania, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a massive stone castle. It is a fortress where a legendary ruler was imprisoned and where the very stone speaks. Story 13. Corvin Castle. The Inscription of the Heartless. The air inside the damp, jagged stone corridors of Corvin Castle in Hunedoara, Romania, does not feel like the fresh, crisp breeze of the Transylvanian mountains. It feels ancient, cold, and carries a thick, suffocating odor of wet limestone, rusted iron, and the faint, metallic tang of old blood that has been trapped in the masonry for over 500 years. When you stand on the massive wooden drawbridge, the silence is not a peaceful or a quiet moment. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a low, rhythmic echoing of water dripping into a deep, dark pit, a sound that feels like a slow, mechanical heartbeat of a fortress that has seen 1,000 betrayals. The texture of the air is thick with a fine layer of moisture that leaves a bitter, earthy taste in the back of your throat. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the massive Gothic towers are leaning in to crush the very breath from your body. As you walk into the Knight's Hall, the texture of the world changes. You feel the cool, slick surface of the marble pillars, but beneath the elegance, the stone is cold, with a moisture that feels like a cold sweat. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes your throat tighten, as if the oxygen is being replaced by the weight of 1,000 secrets. You hear a distant, hollow, metallic scraping, the sound of a heavy chain being dragged across a stone floor. In the year 1443, a 31-year-old man named Yusuf was exactly where a captured soldier of the Ottoman Empire never wanted to be. He was a sturdy, resilient man with a deep knowledge of engineering and a strong will to survive. He was exactly where a prisoner belonged, standing in the middle of the courtyard of the most imposing castle in Eastern Europe, surrounded by high stone walls and guards who spoke a language of absolute and cold authority. Yusuf was a man of quiet observation and immense physical stamina. At 31, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to find a way through the most difficult of circumstances. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a worker who understood the value of a promise. He loved the technical side of his craft, the way a hammer hit the stone and the logic of the earth. He was a healthy, disciplined man of the world who believed in the power of a man's word. He was the kind of person who understood that the castle was a machine, and every stone was a gear that kept it running. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his labor, the way the iron gates clanged shut, and the sound of the birds in the morning. He was a happy man who lived in a world of keys and steel, seemingly untouchable by the darkness of the men who guarded him. He was just a normal guy with a past doing a job he took great pride in for his kin. The ritual of his labor followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of digging and hauling that occupied Yusuf's entire life for 15 long years. Every single morning at 6 o'clock, he and 2 other prisoners would begin the long process of excavating a well in the center of the stone courtyard. It started with the chisels. He would spend nearly 5 hours in the dark, narrow shaft using a heavy iron tool to break away the solid rock, 1 inch at a time. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, his hands covered in the cool, wet earth of the courtyard. After the excavation was finished for the morning, he would move to the heavy wooden buckets. He would spend the middle of the day hauling the heavy debris up to the surface, his muscles burning and his hands covered in a thick layer of gray dust and blood. He had to ensure that the progress never stopped, a slow and silent labor that required his focus. In the late afternoon, the prisoners would gather their tools for cleaning. This was the part of the day that Yusuf found most significant. He would sit on the stone floor, using a piece of rough cloth to wipe the grit from the iron blades. He would watch the shadows of the castle grow long across the courtyard, the sound of the wind in the battlements filling the air like a constant, ghostly wind. He took pride in his role as a builder of a future freedom. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the depth of the well in his mind, ensuring that every inch was a step closer to his home in the south. It was a peaceful, mindless routine of survival in a world built of cold stone and iron bars. He felt safe in the routine, believing that as long as he focused on the physical work, the world would remain stable and the promise would be honored. It was a perfect, mundane life in a place built for the silent. John Hunyadi, the master of the castle, had promised Yusuf and his companions that if they found water in the dry rock, they would be granted their freedom. This promise was the only thing that kept Yusuf moving through the cold of the winters and the heat of the summers for 15 years. He found comfort in the sound of the hammers and the sight of the water buckets being lowered. He was a man who lived on the hope of a single, powerful, and noble word. But by the winter of the 15th year, the mundane rhythm of the digging began to shift in a way that made the air in the pit feel thin and stagnant. The subtle shift happened when Yusuf finally heard a sound that was not the strike of his chisel against the rock. It was a low, rhythmic bubbling coming from the bottom of the shaft. He had found the water. But instead of a celebration, a heavy, vibrating silence fell over the guards who looked down at him. He began to notice that the air in the courtyard was getting much colder than it should be in the middle of the day. The air didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. He heard a sound from the chapel above, a low, rhythmic chanting that wasn't for a celebration. The atmosphere in the fortress changed. The sound of his own heart was loud in his ears as he held the first handful of wet sand from the very bottom. The shift became even more pronounced when he realized that John Hunyadi was no longer at the rim of the well. The man who had given the promise had died, and his wife, Elizabeth Salaji, now controlled the fate of the prisoners. She didn't look at Yusuf with respect for his labor. She looked at him with eyes that were cold and empty of any mercy. A low vibrating hum began to emanate from the walls, and the smell of wet sulfur and iron filled the dark courtyard. You are standing at the bottom of that 90-foot stone well in 1458. You are Yusuf, and you are holding a handful of wet sand, the proof of your 15 years of labor. You look up, and you see the face of the castle's new mistress staring down at you from the light far above. You hear a sound in the dark, a low, wet whisper of the wind through the stones. You feel a coldness that reaches into your marrow. You realize that the promise is being broken. You are cold, your hands are raw, and your back is bent from a decade and a half of digging through the heart of a mountain. You have done the impossible, and you expect to walk out of the gate and begin your long journey home. But as the iron bucket is lowered, it isn't to bring you up to freedom, it is to bring up the last of the debris before they throw you into the dungeon. You are paralyzed by a primal and deep fear of the betrayal you see in her eyes. How do you explain the logic of a world where 15 years of blood and sweat can be erased by a single cruel decision? Is it possible that the human heart can be as hard as the stone of the castle walls? Because Yusuf didn't get his freedom, he was told that he would be executed despite his success. You have to ask yourself if you would be able to keep your sanity knowing that the very water you found would be used by the people who intended to kill you. Do you turn around and beg for your life, knowing that the mistress has never shown mercy to an enemy or a worker? Do you try to use the iron chisel as a weapon, knowing that it is useless against a dozen armored guards? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the well and realize that your death is not just an end, but a beginning for a shadow that will haunt this castle forever? Because here is the thing, Yusuf didn't move. He kept his head down. The bizarre reveal came just before Yusuf and his companions were led to their deaths. He asked for one final request, to be allowed to carve an inscription into the stone wall of the well he had spent a third of his life digging. He used his chisel for the last time to write a message to the owners of the castle. It said, in his own tongue, "You have water, but you have no heart." The energy of that final, bitter truth was absorbed by the very masonry of the site. For 500 years, that inscription has remained a physical part of the castle, a constant and rhythmic reminder of the price of a broken word. The prisoners were executed, their bodies thrown into the dark corners of the fortress, but their spirits remained tied to the water they had discovered. Even more disturbing, the castle later became a prison for the infamous Vlad the Impaler, who was said to have spent 7 years in a dungeon underneath. The energy of the torture and the betrayals that occurred in Corvin Castle created a physical manifestation of grief that still wanders the halls today. People report seeing a woman in white, the ghost of a servant who was murdered by her jealous husband, walking the battlements in the middle of the night. But it is the courtyard near the well that holds the most dread. Paranormal teams have recorded voices in the shaft saying the word heart over and over. Today, Corvin Castle stands as a hulking, Gothic monument to the failures of human mercy and the dark secrets that stone walls can keep. It is a place where the energy of the past is so thick it feels like a physical presence. Visitors report feeling a sudden icy hand on their neck as they walk past the well. It serves as a haunting reminder that some places are so saturated with pain that they become a doorway for the dark and the mysterious. Yusuf was a man who believed in the safety of a promise, but he learned that some things don't care about honor. He spent 15 years building a source of life, only to find his own end at the hands of the people he served. He is a reminder that the world is much darker than we like to admit, and some stone walls should never have been built. He remains a silent shadow in the center of the courtyard, where the water is still cold and the heart is gone. The Castle of Transylvania proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring souls to the very stone where they were betrayed. But as the shadows continue to move through the courtyard of Romania, thousands of miles away in the rugged hills of Northumberland, England, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a much more intimate kind of torture. It is a castle where a specialized room was built for the breaking of bones. Story 14. Chillingham Castle, the Butcher of the Dungeon. The air inside the pink stone walls of Chillingham Castle in Northumberland does not feel like the fresh, chilly breeze of the English borderlands. It feels incredibly dense, dry, and carries a thick, suffocating odor of ancient dust, rusted iron, and the faint, metallic tang of old blood that has been trapped in the masonry for over 700 years. When you stand in the lower dungeon, the silence is not a peaceful or a quiet moment at all. It is a heavy, vibrating pressure that you feel in your very teeth, a silence that seems to be holding its breath as if it is waiting for the next scream to echo through the corridors. You hear a sound that is not the wind, but a low, rhythmic scratching coming from the bottom of the oubliette, a deep and dark pit where prisoners were thrown to be forgotten. The texture of the air is thick and gritty, leaving a bitter, alkaline taste in your mouth. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the massive stone blocks are leaning in to listen to your pulse. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes every step feel like you are walking through invisible water. You hear a distant, hollow metallic click that seems to come from a heavy iron rack moving by itself in the darkness. It is a sensory warning that you are in a place where the art of human suffering was perfected over many centuries. In the year 1298, a 30-year-old man named John Sage was exactly where a battle-hardened soldier of the English army was supposed to be. He was a sturdy, resilient man with a deep knowledge of combat and a strong will to serve King Edward I. He was exactly where a loyal fighter belonged, standing on the front lines of the border wars between England and Scotland. He was a person of solid physical strength and clear duty. John Sage was a man of quiet observation and immense physical stamina. At 30 years old, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to remain cold and focused during the heat of a violent siege. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a specialist who understood the mechanics of force and the necessity of absolute control. He loved the routine of the camp, the shared jokes with his fellow infantrymen, and the solid weight of a broadsword in his hand. He was the kind of person who understood that the war was a machine, and every man was a gear that kept the kingdom safe. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his shifts, the way the iron gates of the border fortresses clanged shut, and the sound of the drums in the morning. He was a happy man who lived in a world of steel and leather, seemingly untouched by the moral weight of his actions. He was just a normal guy doing a job he took great pride in. The ritual of maintaining the castle defenses followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of manual labor that occupied John's entire day for several years. Every single morning at 6 o'clock, he would begin the long process of inspecting the armory. It started with the blades. He would spend nearly 3 hours using a heavy whetstone to sharpen the iron pikes and the swords. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the heat of the friction on the metal. He would then move to the catapults. He would spend the middle of the day checking the heavy tension ropes and the wooden frames, ensuring that the machinery of war was exactly where it needed to be. He had to be careful to grease the iron winches, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. He liked the mechanical certainty of the defense, the way the gears and the pulleys moved like precise parts of a massive and very powerful clockwork. In the late afternoon, John would work on the gatehouse. This was the part of the day that he found most rewarding. He would crawl into the narrow spaces above the portcullis, the sound of his breathing echoing in the small stone tunnels. He would spend hours checking the chains and the counterweights, ensuring that the castle remained an impenetrable fortress. He took immense pride in his role as a protector, knowing that his work was preserving a kingdom. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the inventory of the arrows in a heavy leather-bound journal, ensuring that every quiver was accounted for with a steady hand. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe within the walls, believing that as long as he focused on the physical structure, the world would remain stable. He was a man in control of his path. It was a perfect life. But after a particularly brutal injury ended his career as a frontline soldier, John Sage was given a new role within Chillingham Castle. He was appointed as the official executioner and torturer of the dungeon. The mundane rhythm of his life began to shift in a way that would lead to a terror that lasted for generations. The subtle shift happened when John realized that he enjoyed the sound of the iron tools hitting bone more than he enjoyed sharpening swords. He began to feel an overwhelming sensation of power over the prisoners who were brought into his chamber. He moved his bed into the dungeon itself, preferring the cold and the dark to the warmth of the barracks. The air in the lower levels didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. He heard a sound from the oubliette, a low, rhythmic whispering of the dying that seemed to fuel his own dark and growing obsession. John spent his mornings in the torture chamber, a room designed with a specialized sloping floor so that the blood of his victims would drain away into a central hole. He would spend nearly 5 hours oiling the wooden rollers of the rack and testing the sharpness of the branding irons. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the cold weight of the metal in his palm. He liked the mechanical certainty of the pain he was about to deliver to his victims. He would then move to the Iron Maiden. He would spend the middle of the day adjusting the interior spikes, ensuring they were positioned to cause the maximum amount of suffering without killing the prisoner instantly. He had to be careful to ensure the hinges were silent, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. He liked the way the heavy door would click shut, sealing the fate of the man inside. He was a craftsman of the absolute dark. In the late afternoon, the prisoners would be brought down for their interrogation. This was the part of the day that John Sage found most rewarding. He would sit on a wooden stool, watching the shadows of the torches grow long across the stone walls. He would listen to the rhythmic thumping of his own heart as he prepared to work. He took pride in his role as the master of the dungeon, knowing that his work was essential to the secrets of the border war. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the confessions of his victims in a heavy journal, ensuring that every detail was documented for the lord of the castle. It was a peaceful, mindless routine of cruelty in a world built of cold stone and iron bars. He felt safe in the routine, believing that as long as he focused on the physical work, he was doing his duty for the crown. It was a perfect, mundane life in a place built for the silent and the dead. But by the winter of 1305, the mundane rhythm of his cruelty began to shift in a way that made even the castle guards whisper in the dark. The subtle shift happened when John Sage was given a young girl to interrogate, the daughter of a rival border lord. He didn't just question her, he spent 3 days in absolute silence with her in the chamber. The air in the dungeon became so thick with malice that the torches began to flicker and die. You are standing in that dark, cold torture chamber in 1305. You are a guard who has just entered to deliver a message to John Sage. You see the girl chained to the wall, and you see John standing over her with an iron tool in his hand. You hear a sound from the corner, a low, wet whisper that calls your name from the shadows. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, and the smell of wet sulfur and old blood fills your entire lungs. You look at John Sage and you realize that he is no longer the man you served with on the front lines. His eyes look like 2 pits of empty, swirling smoke, and his skin is as pale as the limestone walls. He turns to look at you, and you feel a coldness that reaches into your marrow. Do you stay and deliver your message, knowing that the man in front of you has become a monster? Do you try to run, knowing that the iron gates are already locked behind your back? Do you tell yourself that this is just the nature of war, and that John is doing what must be done for the king? Or do you listen to that voice in your soul that tells you that you are standing in a place where the barrier between the worlds is broken? Because here's the thing. The guard didn't wait to find out the answers. He dropped his message and ran back to the surface. But John Sage stayed in the dark, and his cruelty only became more refined and more violent. The bizarre reveal came when John Sage finally took his own life after a decade of service in the dungeon. He was found hanging from the very rack he had used on hundreds of people. But the mystery didn't end with his death. During a restoration of the castle centuries later, workers discovered a secret compartment behind a wall in the pink stone hallway. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of a young boy who had been buried alive behind the masonry. The boy was found with his hands pressed against the stone, as if he had been trying to push his way out until the very end. He became known as the Blue Boy because witnesses reported seeing a blue, glowing figure hovering over the beds in the castle's guest rooms. The energy of his terrifying and slow death was absorbed by the very castle, creating a haunting that has lasted for 700 years. The boy was just one of the many victims of the Sage era. Today, Chillingham Castle is known as the most haunted castle in Britain. It is a world-famous site of paranormal activity where the past is always just a shadow away. Visitors report seeing the ghost of John Sage wandering the torture chamber and hearing the sound of a child sobbing behind the walls of the Pink Room. The energy of the executions and the ancient trauma is etched into the very stone. It serves as a haunting reminder of the violent border wars. The castle remains a place of profound mystery and ancient dread, where the barrier between the living and the dead is as thin as a sheet of paper. People who work there report being touched by invisible hands and seeing the shadows of the prisoners moving through the unmapped tunnels. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused pressure. It is a monument to a history written in blood and law, a place where the butcher of the dungeon is still waiting for you. John Sage was a man who believed in the safety of his duty, but he learned that the darkness of the dungeon has a memory that survives through the centuries. He is a reminder that the energy we leave behind can become a presence that survives long after our names are forgotten. Chillingham stands as a silent witness to a history written in isolation and the deep eternal memory of the stone walls. It is a house of many shadows and many ancient and deep secrets. The Castle of Northumberland proved that a location can hold on to a malice that survives through the centuries, anchoring souls to the very floorboards where they took their final breath. But as the shadows continue to move through the halls of Chillingham, hundreds of miles to the south in the county of Dorset, there is a place where the hauntings are not tied to a dungeon, but to a grand manor house. It is a place where a ghost, known as the Grey Lady, walks the gardens. Story 15. Athelhampton House, the secret behind the panels. The air inside the Great Hall of Athelhampton House in Dorset does not feel like the fresh floral breeze of the English countryside in the spring. It feels incredibly ancient, heavy, and carries a thick, suffocating odor of polished oak, beeswax, and the faint metallic tang of cold stone that has been standing since the 15th century. When you stand near the massive fireplace, the silence is not a peaceful or a quiet moment at all for your weary ears. You hear a sound that isn't the wind, but a low, rhythmic scratching coming from behind the heavy wooden paneling, a sound that feels like a small animal trying to find its way out of a dark and narrow space. The texture of the air is thick and stagnant, leaving a bitter, dry taste in the back of your throat that makes you want to cough. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in your chest, as if the very walls are leaning in to tell a secret in the dark. As you walk toward the state bedroom, the world changes. You feel the cool, slick surface of the linen fold carving, but beneath the beauty, the wood is cold with a moisture that feels like a cold sweat. The air carries a suffocating quality that makes your heart race, as if the oxygen is being replaced by the weight of several centuries of family grief. You hear a distant, hollow, metallic click, the sound of a heavy latch moving by itself in the deep silence. In the spring of 1921, a 30-year-old man named George was exactly where a dedicated caretaker of a historic English estate was supposed to be. He was a steady, hard-working man with a deep respect for tradition and a talent for maintaining the delicate fabrics and woods of the Tudor era. He was exactly where a provider belonged, walking the grand corridors of one of the finest manor houses in the county. He was a person of solid and quiet character. George was a man of quiet observation and immense physical stamina. At 30 years old, he was known for his steady hand and his ability to see the beauty in the small details of the craftsmanship that most people overlooked. He wasn't just a worker, he was a guardian of the house's soul, someone who understood that every piece of furniture had a memory. He loved the routine of his work, the shared quiet of the morning, and the solid weight of his cleaning tools. He was the kind of person who understood that Athelhampton was more than just a house. It was a living history that required constant and loving attention. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his shifts, the way the morning light hit the stained glass windows and the sound of the birds in the topiary gardens. He was a happy person who lived in a world of tangible reality, seemingly shielded by his logic from any darkness. He was just a normal guy with a job. Tonight, I am going to tell you a story about a place that has seen more than its fair share of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. But before we get into our case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to take the like button for a private tour of a haunted manor, but the second it hears a scratching sound behind the walls, I want you to run for the garden gate and lock it from the outside as you leave the house. Also, if you would not mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. We really do appreciate all the support you guys give to the team here. It means a lot to everyone. Now, let us get into our story. The ritual of maintaining the Great Hall followed a meticulous, repetitive cycle of labor that occupied George's entire morning. Every single day at 6 o'clock, George would begin the long process of polishing the wood. It started with the beeswax. He would spend nearly 3 hours in the Great Hall using a soft cloth to rub the wax into the dark oak panels. He would move in slow, deliberate motions, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm. He had to be careful to reach every corner, a slow and silent labor that required his absolute focus. He liked the mechanical certainty of the work. He would then move to the brass fixtures. He would spend the middle of the day using a small brush and a cleaning solution to remove the tarnish from the fireplace tools and the door handles. He would listen for the rhythmic sound of the metal being scrubbed, a sound that filled the quiet room like a constant heartbeat. After the brass was polished, he would record the maintenance tasks in a heavy leather-bound journal. He liked the order and the clarity of the daily list. In the late afternoon, George would walk through the gardens to check the fountains. This was the part of the day that he found most rewarding. He would stand by the water, watching the shadows of the pyramid-shaped yew trees grow long across the lawn. He would spend an hour ensuring that the water flow was steady and that the stone basins were clean. He took immense pride in his role as a caretaker, knowing that his work was preserving a legacy for the future. He would spend the final hour of his day recording the garden observations in a separate logbook, ensuring that every detail was documented with a steady hand. It was a peaceful, mindless routine that provided him with a sense of perfect order and control. He felt safe within the stone walls, believing that as long as he focused on the physical structure, the world would remain stable and predictable. It was a perfect, mundane life in a place built for the silent. But by the summer of 1921, the mundane rhythm of his life began to shift in a way that made the air in the Great Hall feel thin. The subtle shift happened when George was polishing the panels near the secret staircase. He began to hear a sound that was not a bird or the wind. It was a low, rhythmic scratching coming from directly behind the wood, as if something with small, sharp claws was trying to dig its way out of the wall and into the room. He began to feel an overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that were level with his own, even when he was completely alone in the hall. The air in the house didn't just feel cool, it became stagnant and heavy with a quiet, vibrating sense of dread. He heard a sound from the gallery above. A low, rhythmic rustling like a heavy silk dress dragging across the floorboards. The atmosphere in the manor changed. The sound of his own heart was loud in his ears. The shift became even more pronounced during his evening rounds. George started seeing a woman in a long gray dress standing near the fireplace. She wasn't a blur, she was a mass of pure, concentrated shadow that radiated a sense of absolute and ancient grief. She didn't have a face, only a presence that made his blood turn to ice. He began to call her the Grey Lady, and he noticed that she always seemed to be looking at the paneling where the scratching was loudest. One night, George decided to stay in the Great Hall after dark to find the source of the noise. He sat in a chair with a lantern, listening to the rhythmic scratching get faster and more frantic. He saw the Grey Lady appear at the top of the stairs, her hands reaching out toward the wall. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the stones, and the smell of old dust and wet sulfur filled the room. He realized that the house was hiding a trauma from the 19th century. You are standing in that dark, cold, great hall in 1921. You are George, and you have just realized that the scratching is not coming from a rat. You see a section of the wood paneling begin to vibrate, and you hear a sound from inside, a low, wet whimper that sounds like a small child or a primate. You turn your lantern toward the wall, and you see a shadow move behind the cracks. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure on your chest, making it hard to take a breath. You look at the Grey Lady and you realize that she is not trying to haunt you. She is trying to find something she lost a long time ago. She turns her head toward you, and you feel a coldness that reaches into your marrow. Do you try to open the secret panel, knowing that the thing inside might have been there for decades? Do you try to run for the door, knowing that the shadows are already closing in? Or do you listen to the absolute silence of the room and wait for the truth? How do you explain the logic of a world where a pet can be forgotten behind a wall until it becomes a ghost? Is it possible that the human heart can be so distracted by grief that it forgets to look in the most obvious places? Because the legend of Athelhampton says that a young woman of the Martin family was so heartbroken by a failed romance that she failed to notice. Her pet ape had followed her into a secret passage. You have to ask yourself if you could live with that. Do you try to rationalize the scratching as the house settling, or do you listen to the rhythmic pattern and realize it is a plea for help from the dead? Do you tell yourself that the Grey Lady is just a trick of the light, or do you admit that you are standing in a place where the energy of a tragic accident is still active today? Because the scratching didn't stop that night. It continued for months, a constant and rhythmic reminder of a life that was lost in the dark. The bizarre reveal came when a later owner of the house decided to renovate the Great Hall. They removed a section of the paneling near the secret stairs, and they found a small, hidden chamber that was not on any of the blueprints. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of a small ape, its hands still pressed against the back of the wood. The animal had starved to death in the dark, unable to find the latch to get back out into the room where its mistress lived. The Grey Lady was believed to be the spirit of the woman who had lost her pet. She was searching for the animal she had accidentally entombed, her grief so powerful that it anchored her to the Great Hall for hundreds of years. The energy of the ape's terrified and slow death was absorbed by the very wood George polished every day. Even more disturbing, visitors to the house have reported seeing two phantom duelists fighting in the Great Hall, adding to the layers. Today, Athelhampton House is known as one of the most haunted houses in England. It is a world-famous site of paranormal activity where the past is always just a shadow away. Visitors report seeing the Grey Lady wandering the gardens and hearing the sound of a small animal scratching at the walls of the Great Hall. The energy of the tragedy is etched into the very grain of the oak. It serves as a haunting reminder that some secrets are built into the very walls. The manor remains a place of profound mystery and ancient dread, where the barrier between the living and the dead is as thin as a piece of wood. People who work there report being touched by invisible hands and seeing the shadows of the past moving through the unmapped passages. The atmosphere remains one of heavy, focused pressure. It is a monument to a history written in silence and regret, a place where the Grey Lady is still looking for her lost and silent friend. George was a man who believed in the safety of his labor, but he learned that the darkness of the manor has a memory that survives through the centuries. He is a reminder that the energy we leave behind can become a presence that survives long after our names are forgotten. Athelhampton stands as a silent witness to a history written in isolation and the deep, eternal memory of the stone walls. It is a house of many shadows and many ancient and deep family secrets. The House of Dorset proved that a location can hold on to a malice and a sorrow that survives through the years, anchoring souls to the very rooms where their hearts were broken. But as the scratching continues behind the panels of England, thousands of miles away in the rugged hills of New South Wales, Australia, there is a place where the hauntings are tied to a massive homestead. It is a house where every single person who lived there met a violent or tragic end. And that's the story for today. If you've stayed with us all the way to this moment, I just want to say thank you so much. The community of fans around MrBallen is what truly makes these strange, mysterious, and unforgettable stories possible. Your support, your views, your comments, and your curiosity are the reason these stories continue to be told. If you enjoy stories that are strange, dark, and mysterious, yet true, don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next video. Thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next story.